All right, everybody, welcome. Assalamu alaikum to our last and final lecture. Let's see if I can get this to work. It's the season finale. You've made it this far. You've survived. A lot of people stuck in there. Thank you for all of your time and effort in dealing with me and this material. I know it's some very difficult material. I do want to do some acknowledgments. I want to do them up front so that everyone hears them, because I know some people will need to leave early. I absolutely wanted to thank my sister, Dr. Sarah Dean, for moderating despite her busy schedule. Please make sure to follow her on South Coast Interfaith Council. That's the YouTube link. It'll be available in the notes. I'd like to personally thank Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi Saab, for seeing something in me and giving me a chance to do this. Mr. Ghamidi is an inspiration to me and a hero of Islam. Words cannot express my appreciation for his work and efforts to which he dedicated and risked his life for. I'd also like to personally thank Mr. Faisal Haroon and Mr. Farhan Sayed and the rest of the amazing Ghamidi Center support team for providing the venue and technical support to teach this course. I know it is a very large time commitment, especially with everything else that they're doing. They're, I think they're both software engineers, or they have full-time jobs, and yet they still do all this thing for Ghamidi Center and for this course. I'd also like to thank Mr. Hassan Ilyas and Dr. Shehzad Salim, two of the scholars of Al-Mawrid and the Ghamidi Center, for their friendship and scholarly guidance. I'd like to thank all of you taking this course, friends and colleagues, people who I've met in this course, and friends in my regular life who have joined to take this course. It's a big time commitment, and thank you for your engagement in this course. And it's really surpassed my expectations, your involvement and engagement with the course. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank my wife for bearing me, supporting me, and most importantly, not divorcing me while I grabbed this opportunity and ran with it. It was seriously a very, very large time commitment. And I mean, it puts a strain when you're already working full time and going to school. So I really appreciate her and her commitment. That was a joke, by the way, about the divorcing. That's not anyways. All right. Now, I still want you to stay in touch, even though this is our last class. We will do a virtual get-together, a coffee. Omar had this idea, so thank you for that idea. We'll announce it on Google Classroom. And it's only intended for people, really for the people who have joined us on Zoom. If you've been a regular on YouTube or Facebook, you can email me. But really, I want this to be an intimate discussion with the people who took the time to be in the classes. So I really appreciate that. Our next class, so this is the last lecture of this class. We will someday in the future teach a follow-on class on modern Islamic intellectual history. I do need at least a few months, if not a year, to recharge my batteries. Keep outlook for, or keep an eye on this class. And you can follow the Ghamidi Center website, but we do hope to teach that. And, they did invite me to teach this follow-on course, so I didn't accomplish my task of getting fired. It really shows their commitment to intellectual openness that they would, endorse such courses. So thank you again. Keep in touch with me through email. I've also joined the dark side. So I have joined Facebook, which I had a dummy account, but now I've made it an undummy account. That is my profile name. I've also joined Twitter, believe it or not. I have to figure out how to use these things. I literally just did this before this class. And finally, that I'm on YouTube. I do plan on this summer is the plan. I do plan on launching my own YouTube channel or show. It's probably going to have a different URL than my personal YouTube, but follow me there. I'm going to talk about the YouTube channel in the show at the end of this lecture, if you're interested. And finally, of course, continue to follow the Ghamidi Center of Islamic Learning. If you're not going to take my class, or if I'm going to teach that much later, they are, I think, constantly teaching other courses that are very fascinating. All right, so let's begin our final lecture. What is Islam? Ethics, Politics, and Literature. This lecture is dedicated to Professor Shahab Ahmad, who passed away in 2015, and it is named after the book. It's like a 600, 700 page book that I recommend that you read. So the necessary disclaimers, of course, that these are my own views, do not necessarily reflect that of Ghamidi Center. or Mr. Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. I'm associated to Harvard University as a PhD student. And this is a broad survey course in which we're taking an academic approach to the subject matter. I do want to clarify something from my last lecture. I misspoke horribly and ended up slandering Fareed Zakaria. He is not a neocon. He has been accused of being a neoliberal, which is a world of a difference. So I do want to clarify that. And to be honest, I like a lot of work that Fareed does. All right, let's recap now. We've had this whole 9 classes. This is our 10th one. We have to admit that we couldn't cover all of Islamic intellectual history in just 10 classes. And we had to siphon off modern Islamic intellectual history for another course. But we have had the opportunity to survey many of the major groups and trends in the formative classical and medieval periods of Islamic history. So I think we can be proud of the fact that we have done that. We have covered Sunni traditionalism, Shiism, Sufism, Islamic theology, rationalism, and philosophy. And by covered, I just mean very broadly speaking. There's no way that you in any of these topics you could spend your entire life. So this is just an introduction that we've given to all of these. But I think a meaningful introduction, not a superficial one. We've eschewed a saved sect mentality. And by doing that, we have come to appreciate that Islamic history has been characterized by a great deal of internal diversity. However, this process of expanding our vision to encompass all of this variety and contradiction in Islamic history may leave some of you, some of us, bewildered. In this lecture, we will try to take a step back, tie it all together, and ask the question, what is Islam? And someone did ask this at the beginning of our course, what is so Islamic about these Islamic philosophers when we were talking about Avicenna, etc. And that's interesting that in Shahab Ahmad's book, he asked this exact question at the start of his book. What is so Islamic about these Islamic philosophers? So I'm going to try to answer this question. Now, of course, one tendency in Islamic history, which has been revived in the modern period, is to simply cast aside all of this as un-Islamic. Another extreme, of course, is to proclaim that anything Muslims do is by definition Islamic. I will try to take a middle course. I will be arguing, in line with the great late Professor Shahab Ahmad, that Islam is characterized as a discursive tradition. Although I hope to also leave you with something a little bit more concrete than perhaps Professor Ahmad does. I'm hoping that you can mediate between what we as insiders might want to consider the kernel and core of Islam as some sort of metaphysical object out there, and the historical and human phenomenon that is Islam in its plenitude and complexity of meaning. And when I use the phrase historical and human phenomenon, I am not at all denigrating that. That's not something that I'm trying to poo-poo. That's something that I think we should embrace and we should tap into, because that's a very profound legacy that we are inheriting. Now, we talked about this in previous lectures. Should we just call someone Muslim as opposed to Islamic? So what is this difference between Islam versus Muslim? I would ask this question, is it not a meager view of Islamic intellectual history to insist that all of these groups, the Islamic mystics, rationalists, philosophers, scientists, literateurs that we're going to talk about in this lecture, artists, humanists, again in this lecture, ethicists, were they all just Muslim and not Islamic? Are we not thereby ceding the point to Orientalists and anti-Muslim ideologues that every good thing in Islamic history only came about incidental to Islam and not because or through it? What then does it mean to be Islamic? That is the question we're going to ask again and again. So in this lecture, we're going to use the case study of adab and the akhlaq literature. And this is so we can cover this topic, because as I said before, it will be criminal not to touch on this topic. But we're not only going to cover this topic, but in the back of our minds, we're going to be keeping this question, what is Islam and what does it mean to be Islamic? And I think this category will really, maybe challenge you to think beyond just the simplistic thinking that we kind of grew up on, that it's just Quran and Hadith. So now, adab is difficult to translate. Literally, it means behavior. It's an Urdu word, so many of you are familiar with it. Of course, it's an Arabic word, but I mean, it's also an Urdu word. But it really refers here to a genre of Islamic literature that includes both prose and poetry, and was meant to cultivate refined morals, courtesy, and urbanity. Akhlaq, meanwhile, refers to ethics and can be considered a subgenre of adab. We will consider them together. So we're going to use them interchangeably. We'll call it the adab akhlaq literature. And this adab akhlaq literature can be characterized as a synthesis of the scriptural sources of Islam, that is the Quran and the Hadith, with elements drawn in from different cultures, particularly pre-Islamic, Arabian, Greek, Christian, and Iranian sources that all came under Muslim rule. So it was the synthesis of Islam with these other pre or extra Islamic sources. And in this quote, we read a form of eudaimonism, which is basically how human beings seek pleasure is the word, or happiness, but really it means fulfillment, flourishing, human flourishing. So this is a prominent theme in Greek philosophy, and it is what provided the framework for this synthesis. Now, of course, this was Islamicized, and it was not only flourishing in this world that we're talking about, but flourishing and happiness, success in the next life. And I apologize for the typo there. I just barely finished these lecture slides in time, and I apologize for that. So there might be typos here and there. But this genre is often said to fall under what is called Islamic humanism. We'll try to define what Islamic humanism is shortly. Now, adab akhlaq is part of practical philosophy and is often called philosophical ethics, or it came to be called philosophical Sufi ethics as well once it got integrated into the Sufi framework. It can also be referred to as virtue ethics. So let's break that down. So as far as practical philosophy, basically there was theoretical philosophy, which we've already covered in this course, and you might have found it very spacey. Sorry. All right. But here, this is really practical philosophy, how to be an ethical person. I think this is something that we can all easily relate to. Let's talk about what virtue ethics means, though. Virtue ethics emphasizes the virtues or moral character leading to good action. This can be contrasted to the law-based approach to religion, which emphasizes rules, duties, and laws, as well as the consequences or punishments associated therewith. In other words, there was this idea that instead of, forcing people to follow certain rules and thinking that that was the ambit of religion, here we're trying to get these virtues to be inculcated into human beings so that they become good people just by their very nature. And one of the key thinkers in this, is what we can call Islamic humanism, is Ibn Miskawayh, or sometimes scholars just refer to him as Miskawayh. He was a Persian court official, philosopher, and historian of the 11th century. And he wrote this very influential book, The Refinement of Morals, Ta'dib al-Akhlaq. And as some of you may recognize that title. I believe it is the same title that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan would use for his journal. And this book was, of course, based on Aristotle's book on ethics. And Miskawayh freely quotes Aristotle and Plato, as well as the Quran, the Prophet, and other Islamic figures. It's all integrated together. This book will actually go on to influence Imam Ghazali. We are not going to escape Imam Ghazali in any lecture that we do. And through Imam Ghazali, it becomes, quote unquote, mainstream. So let's look at an overview of this book by Miskawayh. These are the chapter headings: the principles of ethics, character and its refinements, the good and its divisions, justice, love and friendship, and the health of the soul. So you see, this is a very different approach to religion than kind of the law-based approach that you may be familiar with. Just look at the title headings: love and friendship. You really wouldn't see that in a fiqh book, right? Or at least from what I have seen. So I think this is a very different approach to religion. And we're going to ask, is this any less Islamic than the kind of Islamist law approach that you and I perhaps grew up on? Right at the start of his book, he talks about reason. Reason is what distinguishes man from the animals and by which he becomes God's deputy. Miskawayh endorses the four virtues. This is also coming from Aristotle. So you have prudence or wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. There is this huge emphasis on justice in this Islamic Persianate kind of tradition that is developing. And you can see that this is very much in line with anything that we could call Islamic ethics. It is not antithetical to Islam in any way, shape, or form. These are some other moral virtues that Miskawayh talked about: modesty, composure, liberality, integrity, gentility, et cetera, et cetera. And then, interestingly enough, he also adds hilm. We talked about hilm in our first lecture, and it refers to mildness or gentleness. And it's also got a counterpart in the Roman clementia. So we see basically that what this ethical literature is doing is it's saying, let's find these virtues in human exemplars. And one of these, and the main one, of course, is the Prophet Muhammad. There's Ali, the Prophet's cousin. And there's also, the other Sahaba and just other Islamic figures. But beyond Islamic figures, they also look to pre-Islamic figures that embodied these virtues, which they found to be Islamic and universal, as well as just people outside the Islamic tradition. Miskawayh also emphasizes justice of the virtues, and we see that this is a recurring theme in Islamic literature. And we note that here's where that element of humanism comes. So we're going to try to define humanism, but I'm avoiding it for right now, but we'll do it shortly. But we see how in Miskawayh's text, there's this kind of universalism. We have to be just not only towards most fellow Muslims, but we have to be just towards people who are everywhere in the world, people who are close to us, people who are far away from us, and even towards animals, towards all men and animals. And this is the concept of insaniya, which we talked about in a previous lecture, or humanism is one translation, but this really here is humanism. So what humanism is, and by the way, the term Islamic humanism is contested. Some scholars do not like this term and say it's meaningless. I think it's a fine shorthand to use. I use humanism in the sense, and we defined humanism, if you remember, I think in the previous lecture. But basically humanism, as I see it, is two things. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong here. But number one is it's when, at least European humanism, was when they looked beyond just Christian sources and they looked at the sources from antiquity or the classical tradition. They drew upon that. So there was this, and based on that, there was this idea of universalism, that morality is not something limited to your own religion, but involves all of humanity. And so that is then linked to this insaniya, or this humanism or humaneness. I don't know if that's a word, but okay, humanity, maybe that's a better word. All right. Now, Miskawayh has a whole chapter on love, and he says, justice ideally depends on love. If those who deal with one another are bound by love, then they will be fair to one another. And he endorses the golden rule. If the citizens of a state love one another, they will be in close relation, and each man will wish for his companion what he wishes for himself. So there's the golden rule in the key Islamic ethics text. So that's important because many Islamophobes claim that Muslims don't have this idea of the golden rule. It's in our, the absolute main text of ethics. Now, this sort of love and unification of the hearts, according to Miskawayh, results only when people direct their face towards the face of God. Okay, so he is taking all of this and integrating it into an Islamic framework. This is not a secular text. Many Orientalists have tried to claim that this is a secular text, and they kind of, ignore the religious aspect of it. But I think we're doing a disservice. Actually, I think it's epistemic violence to do that. We see clearly that he does put great value in obedience to God and facing, directing all our gratitude towards God. And in fact, the love that we have for human beings is only grounded in our love for God. And that's right here, our love is modeled upon divine love. He also has a whole section on friendship. So that's interesting. I never grew up with, when I was studying Islam, traditionally there was no emphasis on friendship, but this makes a whole chapter in Miskawayh's book. Quote, and this is Miskawayh writing, "We have already spoken of the need which people have for one another, and it has become clear that every one of them finds its completion in his friend. They become by agreement and harmony as one single person. That is, human beings by nature are social. They took the Greek words that you're probably familiar with, but that human beings by nature are political. They meant by this civic, that is, we require others to complete ourselves. We can't live in isolation. The cause of this love, writes Miskawayh, is fellowship, for man is by nature inclined to fellowship. And in fact, Miskawayh says that there's some debate about where the Arabic word insan or human comes from. He does not agree with the idea that it comes from forgetfulness. He instead says it comes from the root word for sociability or friendliness. He writes, friendship among virtuous people is for the sake of good and is caused by the good. So there's an emphasis on doing good. And then he writes that even Islamic law, Sharia, revolves around this concept of sociality or friendship. And he writes, perhaps the law preferred communal prayer to individual prayer so that people meet and greet each other and we stay social. So there's a little bit of Durkheim here. Miskawayh, of course, also mentions Friday prayer and Hajj and says that people basically from all over the globe come to do Hajj. So that shows that Islam is encouraging this social aspect. He writes, this is some good advice about friendship. So when you gain a friend, you should pay much regard to him or her and do your utmost in looking after him. Do not neglect to fulfill even a slight obligation towards him. That's probably a very high bar to meet. And then consider how you can comfort your friend just as you would comfort yourself. So again, the golden rule. And then of course he says, beware of slander and listening to it. Again, this is not anything that's antithetical to Islam. In fact, it is part of the Islamic tradition. He writes about diseases of the soul, anger, vanity, arrogance, basically everything that's social media causes, perfidy, wrongfulness, fear, etc. Now, all of these, if you've read Ghazali, Ghazali will adopt these. Ghazali takes up Miskawayh's work in his Ihya, the revival of the religious sciences. This is a multi-volume work. The good news for you is that it's been translated, and it's a beautiful translation. It's an academic translation. I strongly urge you to read this, at least read a few of the books. You don't have to read the whole thing. But it's interesting that Ghazali is deeply influenced by Ibn Miskawayh. As one scholar, Len Goodman, says, no sentence of Miskawayh's ethics is left unexamined when Ghazali takes over the work. Now, on kind of the negative side, Miskawayh's more universalistic philosophical ethics are converted to a more particularist Islamicized Sufi ethics, thereby, on the positive side, assimilating this discourse into Sunni orthodoxy. These are two of the books that I recommend if you're going to read Ghazali's his book, his Ihya. These are two volumes that I recommend, The Marvels of the Heart, and then also Love, Longing, and Intimacy. So you see, this is, again, not stuff that's emphasized, I believe, at least how I grew up as Muslim. It was all about rules and law and following and hellfire and etc. So we're going to just quickly look at these two books of Ghazali so we get a feel for it. So Ghazali, what's interesting is moves away from the exoteric acts of worship, that is those ritualistic acts of worship and legal norms, to tackle what he considers the highest pursuit of man, which is, in his mind, to know God. He is prepared for this knowledge, right, Ghazali, only through his heart. The heart is that which if a man knows it, he knows himself, and if he knows himself, he knows his Lord. And then he gives, so again, I find this very sophisticated, and I really appreciated Ghazali for this. He goes into these metaphors. Some of it does get a little bit tiresome because he really harps on it. The heart is a king, the body is a cavity, the intellect is a horseman. He really likes these metaphors. But anyways, it's part of his psychology of religion. Every man has within his heart a mixture of these four qualities, and he writes these as lordly, demonic, beastly, and brutish. The heart is between the demon and the angel and is attracted by each one of them. Here, I think, again, we would go back to our discussion about whether we would take this literally or metaphorically, but in any case. He writes, the warding off of Satan cannot be achieved save by a knowledge of his ways of entering the heart. The gates from whence Satan enters are, and then he lists them. A lot of them, by the way, I think social media should be number one, but anger, envy, covetousness, greed, etc. Ghazali also mentioned the gates of haste, dirhams and dinars, that is money, wealth, and sectarian and partisan prejudices. Meanwhile, the demon does not enter the heart that is devoid of desire and the heart that is God-fearing. Interestingly, Imam Ghazali, who is kind of the most orthodox of the orthodox, he is against excessive legalism. So I find that very interesting and endearing of Imam Ghazali. Ghazali criticizes what he saw as the legalistic ulama of his time. Now, keep in mind, one, he was criticized by other ulama of his time. And number two is, it's not a critique of all the ulama. So he wasn't calling them all mullahs, as maybe some of us do. He was criticizing what he saw as a specific strain that he was critical of amongst the ulama class, which was their excessive legalism. And I find this very endearing. So he writes, against their, quote, staunch commitment to and exaggeration in the study of the subordinate branches of Islamic jurisprudence. They are, on his view, missing out on the true essence of religion. Ghazali seems to look down on Islamic jurisprudence if understood as, quote, and these are his words, the multifaceted opinions dealing with divorce, commercial dealings in which pay, and rental agreements, etc. All these fine, trivial points. I myself, and this is my self-writing here, I remember studying the complicated Shafi'i rules mentioned by Imam Ghazali himself in his third book, which is on Tahara, in which, quote, the quantity of water has to be a certain amount, and you have to, it's very complicated stuff, and it's funny because when I was actually studying this in the class that I was taking, there was another student who was like, don't you study at Harvard? Why are you starting with like this stuff about wudu and like, you don't even know this basic stuff? And I was like, trust me, they don't teach this stuff at, in the Western Academy. And I did find a lot of it to be very complex, ornate, and unnecessary. This is just my personal feel. And Ghazali seems to think so too. He dispenses with all of that and takes a more simple view, which is the Maliki view, that water is pure unless its color, taste, or smell is altered. That's a much simpler rule. Now, for me, I would simplify that even more. For me, I would say that it goes without saying that you should use clean water. You don't need to ask, what is clean water? I think that's obvious, but that's just my opinion. And I wrote this funny thing because this is if you study certain types of fiqh, you'll see they'll talk about purifying pure water, non-purifying pure water, and impure water. So it's very quasi-scientific. So Ghazali is kind of pushing back against this. I think he could go further, but this is just my bias. Now, he writes further, Ghazali writes, in this present age, there has appeared a group who call their folly cleanliness and say this is the foundation of religion. So he's pushing back against this over-obsession, as I think it was Freud who would call it a neurosis, an obsessive-compulsive neurosis of certain group of kind of highly conservative religious people where you're hyper-obsessed with this cleanliness of, is there something impure on me? And it goes to this kind of obsession. So Ghazali writes, quote, it is not fitting to spend time with this outward purification beyond what is necessary. And then he reinforces the point that the most important matter is inward purification of the soul. For Ghazali, the true essence of religion is twofold. The first is to attain awareness of God, and the second is to live the ethical life. I think that's a pretty good statement and a good direction to head. Now, my own rant, even though I find Ghazali's criticisms of excessive legalism refreshing, I cannot help but feel that the rest of his book, in that specific book, book 3, is riddled with the same rigid ritualism and neurosis he decried earlier. And I think the reason is because he's bound to say that we still have to follow all those rules. He can't dispense with them because he is, quote unquote, a very orthodox scholar. And he's kind of bound up with that. And the example I would give, and this is from Ghazali's book, is how one should wipe one's anus, quote, an odd number of times. As always, of course, a hadith can be adduced to this effect. He should step into the bathhouse with his left foot and say such and such incantation. Prayer before taking a dump, you have to do that before sexual intercourse. This, for me, is very difficult to wrap my mind around, and I think it does go into this kind of neurosis that we were talking about. Now, of course, a defender of such discourse, and I have to be fair and give them a fair saying, a defender of such discourse could say that the religious Muslim converts even the mundane acts into acts of worship. For me, however, it trivializes religion, reducing it to mindless ritualism that consumes all of one's limited cognitive abilities and ultimately leads one to miss the very essence of religion. And I would say this, I take this idea of this limited cognitive abilities. Mark Zuckerberg was once asked, why does he always wear gray t-shirts? And he said, well, I have limited cognitive ability, decision-making abilities, and I want to minimize that. So I don't want to waste some of that on picking a shirt. Now that might be an exaggeration or a legend, but the point I think holds that if every moment of your life you're worried about what foot you're stepping in with, how you're drinking water, how you're doing all this thing, saying this, saying that, I think it's not a coincidence, and I spent some time in Pakistan, that the people who are involved in social justice in Pakistan and human rights were on the less religious side, to be honest. They were on the more liberal secular side, irreligious side. And meanwhile, the religious people weren't involved in any of that. And I think it's partly to do with this hyper obsession on the fine details of ritual practice. So I would take Ghazali even further, but this is just my rant. Okay, let's get back to Ghazali because you were not here for my rants. Okay, so to his credit, Ghazali writes a book of love. Again, we can see the Miskaway in him. And he writes, quote, obviously man loves himself. Obviously too, he may love someone else for his own benefit. But can a man love someone else other than himself for that person's sake and not for his own benefit? Self-love is the first of love's cause. The second cause of love is benevolence. The third cause and a higher cause of love lies in loving a thing for its own sake. And of course, the highest form of love is love of God. All of these causes in their fullest unity and perfection are inconceivable except in the case of God the exalted. In reality, God alone merits love. Now, I don't think that he's saying that you shouldn't love anyone else, because that doesn't make sense with everything else he said. But I think what he's saying is that the true and the real form of love is love of the divine, our love for God and God's love for us, and that everything else is but a shadow of that love. That's how I read Imam Ghazali. Now here's Professor Len Goodman, who is a scholar on, he wrote a book entitled Islamic Humanism. And he writes of Ghazali's appropriation of Miskaway that Miskaway's courtly humanism is systematically expunged. And we see that it is particularized. The universalism of Miskaway is lost, I think, in Imam Ghazali's work. At least that's what Professor Goodman says, and I tend to agree with him. Now, of course, the fate of Miskaway's ethics is emblematic of that of Greek philosophy in general in the Islamic milieu. So basically, this material was absorbed into Islamic orthodoxy, but it was particularized. And the example that Professor Goodman gives, I think, is a worthwhile one. He says it's much like Islamic builders appropriated the structures and stones of Greek basilicas and that had been previously pagan temples, and later used the same architectural principles to construct new, distinctly Islamic mosques and palaces. Now, he writes, Professor Goodman, the resultant values do take root in Sunni orthodoxy in a way that Miskaway's do not. Their pietist colorations mask the foreign origin and structure of the underlying Greek ideas about the mean. So in Miskaway's work, as well as Ghazali's and all of the major works of Islamic ethics, there is this idea of the mean is a good place to be. So you should not be, if you're going to give, and this isn't from the Quran, you can derive it. For example, the Quran says that you should give in charity, but you shouldn't become impoverished. So you shouldn't be excessive in your generosity, but at the same time, you shouldn't be stingy. The best place to be is in the middle or the mean, and this is what is then taken up in Islam from the Greek source, but it's equally found in the Islamic sources. So you see that it doesn't have to be an uncritical acceptance. Neither Miskaway nor Imam Ghazali are doing an uncritical acceptance of anything foreign. Rather, they're trying to see what does fit in the Islamic or the Quranic paradigm. Now, here are some other major works of ethics. We're not going to be able to cover them, but I'm just listing them off. Again, Imam Ghazali, maybe you've heard of Imam Ghazali before. He has The Alchemy of Happiness. We have Nasir ad-Din at-Tusi, who is a major Shi'i scholar. I really wish I had covered more of him. I mean, he was a major thinker, Islamic philosopher, a polymath, really. But his Nasirian ethics were, next to Miskaway, I would say his Nasirian ethics have been the most influential in the Islamic world. And then his work was taken up by Jalaluddin ad-Dawani in Akhlaqi Jalali, or the Jalalian ethics. So this has a long legacy. Now, in addition to this kind of adab literature, another subgenre of it is what's called the mirrors for princes genre. In Arabic, it's Nasihat al-Muluk, or advice for rulers. And there is this mirrors for prince comes from the European term for it, but we see the exact same thing in the Islamic world. And this is basically advice that is written on, by, or for kings on how to act, how to act if you're in a position of power. And through this, we can see what these Islamic ideas were for politics and statecraft, how rulers should behave toward their subjects, how they should conduct themselves in warfare, diplomacy, managing finances, etc. Moreover, it tells us how the ideal ruler should act from an ethical standpoint. Remember, in Islamic philosophy, the idea was that the ruler should really be a philosopher king. He should be the perfect man, the insan, the kamil, the complete man, the perfected man. And so we can glean from this what kind of ethics were important in this Islamic literature. What's interesting is that this mirrors for princes literature holds both Islamic and pre-Islamic figures as exemplars. So you have, for example, some Persian emperors that are held up as models of this kind of perfect man. And they fulfill what are universal and Islamic ethics in their mind. So again, you have Ibn Miskawayh, who even in his text, you can see a hint of this mirrors for princes literature. He writes, religion and kingship are twin brothers, and neither is complete without the other. Religion is a foundation and kingship is a guardian. Now, this idea of religion and kingship being twins is an idea that's taken up from the Persians. It really can go in one of two directions. It could go in the way of, that the kind of commonly held refrain that unlike Christianity and other religions, in Islam, politics and religion can never be separated. You could take this in that direction, but you could equally take it in the opposite direction and say, no, these are two different domains, and even say that this is kind of a proto-secularism, or you could fall somewhere in between. So this is an interesting idea that's in Islamic political theory. But basically the idea is that the philosopher king should protect religion and promote religion. And then the leader should be a true imam and a just king. And there is some indication that Miskawayh himself might have been Shia or proto-Shia, at least. Not proto-Shia, I'm sorry, but maybe Shia leaning, sorry. But it's not quite clear. Now, and then there's this idea, this last sentence that I really want to harp on. This is also coming from, and again, we're trying to ask that question, what is Islam? So there's this recurring idea upon which all historical Islamic political theory is based, on the idea that the relation of a king to his subjects should be a paternal one. This paternalistic model is central to Islamic conceptions. So we see this even seeping into Islamic jurisprudence. So Mawardi, who has the kind of the definitive text on Islamic political theory, unfortunately we're not going to cover him in this course. We simply don't have time. But we see that this idea is very prominent. And I think it is one of the ideas that has been most problematic as far as in the modern period of moving towards kind of liberal democracy. One of the problems has been this kind of paternalism that is in kind of all genres of Islam, of Islamic literature that has to do with politics. Anyways, here is a partial list of the mirrors for princes literature. I just put it out there so you have it in the notes. But an overview of this literature basically shows and highlights a distinctly Persian articulation of Islam, which calls the ruler to piety, justice, and benevolence. The ruler is called to be the model of civility and urbanity that we saw in the adab akhlaq literature. So there is some very positive aspects of this kind of literature. And then there's this kind of, maybe depending on how you feel, not so positive elements of it, that sometimes you can note in this literature a somewhat lax attitude towards wine, women, and most worrisomely, sometimes towards young boys. And we talked about this in a previous lecture. So again, we have to ask the question, are these texts Islamic? We're going to just take a look at one of these. This is the Qabusnama. It was written in the 11th century. It was written by a nominal ruler to his son. What's interesting is this text has a chapter. So this is advice that this ruler is writing to his son, who's going to succeed him. And what's interesting is that there was a chapter in it on the etiquette of wine drinking and of lovemaking. So the question is this Islamic? Well, our first impression from that would be, no, this is not Islamic. Is that the end of the story, though? Let's look at that chapter in a little bit more detail. Let's be fair to the text, at least. So we open it up, and it's that chapter, and this father writes to his son, quote, "While discussing wine drinking, I neither urge you to drink, nor can I tell you not to drink, since young men never refrain from action at anyone's bidding. Many persons spoke to me, but I did not listen, until when I was past 50 years of age, God's mercy granted me repentance. Should it happen to you that you do not drink, you will not only earn rewards in both worlds and win divine favor, but also you will save yourself from public approbation. For these reasons, I should prefer you not to drink. Yet you are young and your friends," and he talks about peer pressure. "If then you drink, set your mind on repentance, pray to God for the blessing of repentance, and be ever regretful for your misdeeds. Be that as it may, if you indulge in wine, then you at least need to know how to drink wine." And then he talks about the etiquette of wine drinking, and he seems to speak from a lot of experience. He does say to drink responsibly, never drink wine in the open. That'll be a bad thing. It'll set a bad example for people. Don't be wasted. And then, of course, don't drink on Fridays. That's our holy day. Don't drink on Fridays. On romantic passion, we see a similar trend. He says, resist falling in love and try not to become a lover. Do not let your heart be completely captivated by someone. But there is this attitude of boys will be boys. Yet when a man is young, he writes, excuses will be found for him, whatever his conduct. Even so, act with discretion. If nevertheless there is someone of whom you are passionately fond, let it at least be a person worthy of your love. And then this is a kind of funny quote. Do not imagine that she, whoever you fall in love with, is regarded by other people with the same eyes as your own. It may be that although in your eyes she is the most beautiful of creatures, in those of others she is the ugliest. And then, if you marry a wife, my son, treat her well with utmost consideration, but don't necessarily seek out a pretty wife. For that, take a mistress. A wife, on the other hand, should be chaste and of sound faith. And then it gets even more borderline, if you can say. He does say that you should not indiscriminately indulge in sexual intercourse, but if you do it, just don't do it as a matter of course. And then he says men need to relieve themselves, so he understands that. And then he writes even more worrisomely that between women and boys, do not confine yourselves to either sex. I think most of us would have some deep problems with this. Now, you could see that he really is a parent who's trying to take this kind of course, and maybe many of us will be faced with the same thing with kids. It's kind of like the idea of, a lot of Christian people face this who are religious. Many perhaps Muslims will face it too. I hope not, but I don't have kids, so what can I say? That don't have sex, but if you're going to have sex, here's a condom. That's really the attitude here. Now, I don't think that this is outstanding parenting on my part, but what do I know? Now, look at the other chapters. This is the point. Let's get to the point, though. The other chapters, chapter number 1 is on knowing God. Number 2 is about the prophets and their missions. 3 is about gratitude to God. Acts of piety is chapter 4. And then showing gratitude to parents, kind of following that Islamic model of that after God or parents. So you see that the question really we have to ask, is this Islamic? He has a whole chapter on the religion, on the religious sciences, and a section on the Sufi path. On religion, he says that you should concern yourself with faith in order to secure for yourself the reward of this world and the next. This is the same person, by the way. He says that as a student of the divine laws, you must become chaste, contented, the friend of learning. How are you reconciling this with his previous advice? I don't know. If you will become a king someday, my son, be God-fearing, Keep eye and hand away from other Muslims, women folk, and let your robe be unspotted, for the unspotted robe means unspotted religion. In sum, I think what we can say is that such pre-modern literature abounds in and is comfortable with complexity, ambiguity, and contradiction. This strikes our modern sensibilities as odd, especially since our religious expression has shifted its emphasis. I'm not saying that this shift is something bad, but only that we risk misreading historical sources if we read them with our presentist lenses. For example, the way we view alcohol now, and keep in mind, I never drink any alcohol, I'm absolutely opposed to it. But as a student of history, I have to accept the fact that this kind of view that we have now is a modern view, that in the Islamic history, wine was tolerated and for a large extent, especially amongst the elites. It is to some extent now, even in Pakistan, amongst the uber elite, but really in the modern period, we see that it's become kind of anathema to drink alcohol. And whether that's a good or bad thing, that's up to you to decide. I think it's a good thing, but really, I think we need to make sure that we're not reading historical sources with our presentist lenses. The other thing is that in the modern period, and I think this has to do with the print culture, especially with the internet now, we've kind of flattened out the discourse so that there can no longer be ambiguities and contradiction. In the pre-modern world, it was perfectly possible to live in contradiction. But because now we live in this world of print media, now we're all kind of reading up on everything, trying to, and also it has to do with enlightenment and post-enlightenment thought, where we just don't like ambiguity. We want everything to be, straightforward and simple and clear. And so this kind of literature is difficult for us to read now. Now, having said all of this, I think that in my opinion, such sources tell us more about the reality of Islamic political life in the pre-modern era than the standard traditionalist fixed sources that Western experts will go to. This is important. So what I'm trying to say here is that this literature, this Mirrors for Princes literature, is important if we want to know what rulers in the pre-modern world, in the Islamic world, how they governed. Because if we just use the Islamic law jurisprudence books, we're going to get a very different picture, one that is far more exclusivist. Meanwhile, these sources, that is the Mirrors for Princes literature, paints a different picture of Islamic rule than the one would get from the more exclusivist approach of the jurists. This Mirrors for Princes and Adab literature seems far less warlike and more tolerant, partly because these rulers saw themselves as universal rulers for all of their subjects. Again, they were the father figure of not just the Muslims. That wouldn't be grand enough. No, they were the father figure for all of their subjects. And just to give one example is, and then we're going to take some questions. We're going to take this again, this is also from the Qabusnama that we read earlier, same book, on pardon and punishment. He's giving his advice to his son. My son, do not feel that men must inexorably be punished for every misdeed. If a man commits a fault, ask forgiveness of yourself for him in your heart, for he too is the offspring of Adam. So we see this humanism, this idea of humanity. So he too is the offspring of Adam, who first brought sin into existence, and who was our father. He writes, inflict no punishment for a triviality. Let nothing rouse you to anger. Deem forgiveness your duty. And then he writes that some people do think that certain crimes mandate punishment by the law, which I assume to mean Islamic law. He writes, however, in my opinion, however, if a man commits a crime for which he must be punished by the law, you should not inflict the full penalty, but should pardon him, thus treading the path of clemency and mercy. And he writes, I have been told that in the reign of Mawiyah, who is the fifth caliph, depending on how you count, a group of men committed a crime which rendered them liable to the death penalty. And he commanded that they should be executed in his presence. And then one of the criminals said, quote, the whole world is aware of your clemency and nobility. This is what the criminal is saying to the caliph. Now, had we committed this crime against a monarch who was not like you, Mawiyah, noble and clement as you are, what would he have done to us? That is, if we were under the rule of a less noble caliph, what do you think that caliph would have done? What punishment would they have given? Now, of course, Mawiyah is forced. There's no worse punishment than death. So then basically the criminal is saying, well, obviously you're not going to give that same punishment, right? And so Muawiyah does pardon everyone except for the man who brought this argument. That guy did get his head chopped off. But anyways, so this book concludes, never believe that it is possible to commit an offense too grievous for pardon. What I'm trying to convey to you is that this is literature that has some gems that we can look to and that can give us inspiration. Finally, we look to this book, The Millennium Sovereign. This is written by Asfar Moin. It's an excellent book. We're going to see that this book is important for reinforcing the point that I was making earlier, that these rulers saw themselves as universal rulers for all of their subjects. And this pushed back, and so the Mughals, for example, all of them, not just Akbar the Great, all of them saw themselves as monarchs that were above religious and sectarian divisions. And by the way, the people who fill their highest offices were a lot of Hindus, so it wasn't kind of exclusivist. So they had this idea of sacred kingship, that, and this idea is necessary so that we don't just look to the pure legalistic texts to see how non-Muslims were ruled. And how these Mughal rulers ruled was based on this Sufi-inflected Islam that gave a special provenance to astrology and mystical powers, ideas of sacred kingship, the ideas of Mahdiism, Messiah, the Messiah, etc. So what this author argues, and I think it's important, is that when we read this history through the lens of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and this is kind of, I think, from what I've seen, I might be wrong, I didn't grow up in Pakistan, but I see that a lot of the kind of school education, they do kind of read this history with this lens of orthodox versus unorthodox. But really what Moin is arguing is that everyone is heterodox if you use that lens. The rulers were all heterodox according to this definition, and the masses were heterodox. So it's a really weird way of viewing history if you do it in this way. Now the Mughals had this idea of sul-i-kul, or universal peace. And so again, we should move away from just viewing, just the legal traditions of Islam. Now, of course, we all know that Akbar supposedly founded this divine religion, Dini Ilahi, which he never used that term, by the way. And what we often see is that Akbar is often represented as some liberal, unorthodox, and eccentric ruler. And yes, he was, of course, all of those things. But what's important to note, and this is what Professor Moin notes, is that Akbar was more a culmination of an already existing phenomenon and trend than some sort of aberration. And here we see that Jahangir, who came after Akbar, also expressed being, part of declaring himself, the universal manifestation. So they did see themselves above religious and sectarian divides. And here we see that Jahangir was allowing someone to convert out of Islam to Christianity because of this. And I think that's a great place now to ask some questions. I know I went on for a while. Do we have any verbal questions? I'll let the moderator see, and then I'll in the meantime, I'll look at these Zoom questions, or I mean these written questions. All right, so Junaid Saab asks, can we get some samples of key recommendations in the Nasihat al-Muluk? Well, those are some of them. For example, be benevolent, be forgiving, etc. Don't oppress, don't tyrannize. And there's also a lot of realpolitik in it as well. That is, actually one of the, let's take a look at that one. One of them, if you look, okay, Ibn Zafar, you see in the middle, right there in the 12th century, this text is said to have influenced Machiavelli, the father of modern political philosophy. So for example, when it came to war, they didn't advocate a lot of these texts. Some of them did, but most of them did not advocate holy war and just go wage crazy jihad against everyone. No, they really were more practical, that war is something that we do based on necessity and your practical rule, as opposed to kind of religious concerns specifically. But in any case. All right, any verbal questions, or should I move on? Dr. Dean?
I don't have, you addressed Junaid's question. No, I don't have anything else right now.
Okay, great. Let's keep going then. All right, so we're pushing the boundaries. We're asking the question, what is Islamic? We're going to look at some Islamic literature. We're turning from now the ethics adab literature to, this could also be considered part of ethics literature, but it's really fiction and poetry and prose. But we're not going to be able to cover a lot of it. It's not my specialty either. But we're going to consider these two works by Saadi, Gulistan and Bostan, which are, according to Shahab Ahmad, quite possibly the two most widely read works of normative Islamic ethics of all time. And this is from an essay that I wrote on this topic. It was literally How Islamic Was Islam's Poet. I included this so that you can read it in the notes. This is just my take on it, my writing. I'm just going to read the highlighted part. From the occasional references to wine and the more frequent and jarring mentions of pederasty, some of the contents of the Gulistan challenged my traditional sense of religious propriety and impelled me to shift uncomfortably in my seat several times while reading it. That is the Gulistan. Saadi's Gulistan began to grow on me, however, as I turned its pages. By the time I reviewed the book for this paper, I found that my initial discomfort had been replaced with deep admiration. From a content standpoint, I admire the more universalistic approach of this literary text as compared to the highly legalistic works of Islam that I grew up with. Gulistan stresses the values of justice, forbearance, hilm, liberality, modesty, and contentment, which are religious, cultural, Sufistic, and universal values. I question the binary choice of viewing the ideas in Gulistan to be either clearly religious or clearly non-religious. I consider it, therefore, an act of epistemic violence to exclude Saadi's Gulistan from the Islamic. And I'm going to read, Professor Ahmad writes, quote, by not labeling something Islamic or by the stronger act of labeling it un-Islamic, we are excluding that thing from being representative of the normative value Islam. Now, continuing my quote, my writing, Saadi is so, and I'm trying to answer the question that we're asking in this lecture, what is Islam? Saadi is so comfortable in his Muslimness or Islamicness that he does not feel the need to constantly assert it against an imagined other, as many us modern Muslims feel compelled to do. In the same way, Western philosophy can just be philosophy, so too could Saadi not feel the need to label or identify himself or his ideas, nor does he need to bracket off the religious from the non-religious. It seems odd and even unjust to consider as non-religious or quote unquote secular a literary text that is littered with Quranic verses, which serve as a sort of muse and are seamlessly integrated into the text as if it is a part of it. That is to say, the Quranic references are organic and subtle, thereby shielding their overt Islamicness. In other words, these scriptural verses are such an embedded part of the cultural tapestry that they start to lose their overt religious distinctiveness, much as the greeting of salam in certain contexts and societies no longer carries with it a definitive religiosity. It is simultaneously Islamic and not simply Islamic. There are strong currents of universality in the Gulistan, which are inspired, at least in part, by the Quran itself. I'm almost done. The first part of Gulistan and then this is where I just talk about how the first part falls under this Mirror for Princes genre, which was very influential to Islamic statecraft. And this is why I'm saying that, and Shahab Ahmad is saying that it's important to refer to this literature. As Shahab Ahmad notes, Western scholars have tended to look at the more exclusivist fiqh genre, which admittedly the contemporary Islamic religious establishment itself seeks to portray as normative. Yet the Muslim Padshahs ruled as God's representatives on earth, in charge of all human beings in their realm, and even of the world. Saadi's words are enshrined on the United Nations building, quote, the sons of Adam are limbs of each other, unquote, and are inspired by the Quran and prophetic tradition. The Padshah is called to be just and forbearing to all his servants. And here's a quote from the Gulistan, quote, a Padshah must practice justice that they may gather around him and clemency that they may dwell in safety under the shadow of his government, unquote. Oppression and tyranny are repeatedly condemned in the Gulistan. And here I just wanted to talk briefly about political, we're going to talk about political theory. I couldn't do it justice in this lecture. But I do see that in this Gulistan, there is a strong emphasis on the idea of not oppressing your subjects. On the other hand, I argue what is lacking, however, is the recognition that absolute rule corrupts absolutely. There are no means of enforcement to curtail government injustice and oppression in the Islamic political tradition. These are ideas that must wait for the dawn of modernity, and even longer in the case of the Islamic world. Even so, like the political works of Al-Farabi and the this is Siyasat Nama, which is another Mirrors for Princes literature. The Gulistan is a treasure for the modern Muslim seeking inspiration from the Islamic past in order to construct a just, universalist, and pluralist ethic in the present. As such, there is an urgency with which we ought to consider such works to be Islamic. That is part of my conclusion. Here is another book of Islamic literature that you should that would be relevant to Islamic ethics, The Conference of the Birds. And then kind of pushing the boundaries is Hafez, or Hafiz, depending on how you pronounce it, and even a couple of more authors who push the boundaries even further. I actually got a little bit uncomfortable when I read some of this, and I actually argued, and it's controversial, I did not feel that Hafez was Islamic. I actually excluded him from Islamic, so I'm drawing the line somewhere. So unlike somebody who's taking Shahab Ahmad to like an, maybe an extreme, I'm not doing that. I think that we can, because are we going to say that there are certain works in the Islamic history where Muslims have produced that are actually quite simply pornographic? Are we going to say that that's Islamic pornography? I think that is kind of stretching this too far. So to review, we have explored some other genres, adab, akhlaq, mirrors for princes, fiction, etc., outside of the hadith paradigm in Islamic law to expand our view of what could be considered Islamic. Islamic ethics, as opposed to law, is a different, and now I should point out, of course, that within Islamic law itself, Sharia, it does have ethics in it. It concerns not only laws, but ethics. That's what a defender of it will definitely say, and I have to appreciate. But I would say that Islamic ethics as a separate branch is either parallel to, or even could even in some ways be in opposition to this kind of law-based approach. But in any case, Islamic ethics, as opposed to law, is a different approach to religion than many of us may have grown up with. And this paradigm offers something that I consider to be less legalistic, exclusivist, and dogmatic. And with that, we shall go to a break. Unless people have questions before we take the break. Any verbal questions? Come on. Nope? Okay. People are being shy, or maybe senioritis. Yep, go ahead.
It's not a question, just want you to know we're enjoying the lecture. Don't worry about it.
Okay, with that, let's take a 7-minute break. We'll see you at 7:10 Central. Thank you. All right, without further ado, let's get started. So we have this persistent question: what is Islam? One possible answer is whatever comes through the Prophet, that is the Quran and the Sunnah, which really we mean the Hadiths, is Islamic. Everything else is un-Islamic, especially if it has foreign origins. This seems to me to be a very Hanbali-like view, which would make someone like Ibn Taymiyyah very happy. I think many of us have been indoctrinated into this worldview since our childhood. I contend, however, that this is a very meager view of Islamic intellectual history and would leave us precious little to hold on to or be proud of. Think of, and I might be proven wrong on this, but this is my sense of it. Think of how little the Hanbalis contributed to the world as compared to their rivals, the Ash'aris, the Mu'tazilis, the philosophers, etc. If we are limiting ourselves to what the Prophet brought, then let us be honest. What so-called Islamic orthodoxy has always focused on is the Hadith. Islamic law, considered the crown jewel of traditional Islamic thought, has always been heavily rooted in the Hadith. My view: I do agree that the core or kernel of Islam can be identified in the Quranic moment, which acted in the world of the Prophet. Islamic religious intellectual history can be considered a discursive tradition of meaning-making in, through, and beyond the Quran. Therefore, I answer what is Islam by identifying which we could consider as believers, the divine core or kernel as the Quran, And everything else is a part of the, quote, historical and human phenomenon that is Islam. I really shouldn't drink caffeine or Coke. It makes me burp a lot. Sorry about that. All right. This allows me, this view of core and kernel, and then everything else is part of this historical and human phenomenon. This allows me to anchor to something firm, that is the Quran, while also embracing an expansive view of the entire gamut of Islamic intellectual history. Instead of viewing Islam as a sealed off box that must be continuously cleansed of quote unquote external accretions that creep into it, I view Islam as a process, Islam in action, acting as it does in the historical real world. My highly controversial contention is that historically Muslims have honored the Quran as a largely ceremonial text to be kissed and placed on a high shelf, physically and metaphorically in an honored and distant space. No pre-modern group that I have seen focused their undivided attention upon the Quran to study it on its own terms. This really is something that only a few people and groups have started to do in the present. The Quran has almost always been mediated through other sources, whether it be through the hadiths in the case of Sunnism, or the hadiths through the Imams in the case of Shiism, or Greek philosophy in the case of Islamic philosophy. The Quran is kissed, again, put on a high bookshelf, and it can be used as an amulet for protection. We perfected the art of calligraphy and produced beautiful and ornate mushafs, the texts of the Quran. The art of reciting the Quran is perfected. We can recite it in an eloquent and melodious way in its various recitations. There's quote unquote sciences of recitation. It's done in a very highly professionalized way. The Quran is recited daily in prayer to completion during the month of Ramadan and during the key events of one's life and death. We elevated the Quran to an uncreated status. Many tafsirs, Quran commentaries have been produced and are studied in the Islamic world. Multiple sciences of the Quran have been developed and are taught in madrasas, and very high-level discussions of fine grammatical points are made by some of the commentators. Paradoxically, however, the one thing that historically we have never done, up until very recently, is sought to understand the Quran on its own terms. And I defined what I meant by this in lecture 1. Of course, this is not to take a completely naive view that we could ever read a text completely unmediated, that is wholly objective, neutral, etc. Our own subjectivities, biases, etc., that is our pretext, will inexorably come into play and are to some extent unavoidable. Yet our limitations notwithstanding, this should not, in my opinion, be used as an excuse to completely abandon the quest to read the Quran on its own terms and as an excuse to layer the Quran with historically later sources. Now, I must clarify, like I did in lecture 1, I'm not endorsing a Quran-only approach. As Professor Jerusha Lamptey says, that we're not advocating unequivocally to dismiss other sources, nor do we advocate a Quran-only approach. Rather, what we're calling to is prioritize the Quran and use it to critically assess any other sources. Now, I am going to skip this section on the Quran. We did this slide before. I'm going to come back to this at the end if we have time. I'm going to talk about something that I wanted to talk about in lecture 1. I didn't back then because I didn't think you were ready at that time. Not you specifically, but people. But now you've proven yourself to be part of the intellectual elite. And so I think you're ready now for this information. And if you have been following social media or the internet, you know that there's a big controversy right now about this going on, based on some statements that Sheikh Yasser Qadhi said, and then a bunch of Christian apologists and Islamophobes jumped on it. And it's this huge controversy about the Quran and its preservation, and about this issue of Quranic variance. I wanted to answer this question. I felt that if my whole worldview is based on the Quran as the key and the kernel, and I'm arguing that it's the earliest source that we have, I need to prove that to you from an academic historical standpoint. So I'm going to dedicate some time to that at the end of this lecture. I just want to make sure that we get through all the slides. And if I run out of time, I'm still going to do it, but you can log off if the time is expired by that time. All right. So let's skip down to, all right. We're going to talk about, so the Quran, I've told you, is the core and the kernel. The question is, does the hadith enter the core or the kernel or not? is it an historical early source, a reliable historical early source? Now, this is not saying that we should throw hadith in the garbage can. I'm not a Quran only person. I'm not arguing for that. But what I would point you to is what, now this, if you know this scholar, Wael Halak, he is like the best source for, I mean, he's like there's questions about what his own religious identity is, but if he is a Muslim, which I think he is like a very traditionalist. I mean, he's a defender of the Islamic law paradigm and traditionalism. You cannot get a better defender and a more intelligent defender of it than him. But if we read his book on the origins and evolution of Islamic law, you see that even he has to admit that, well, first, the thing that we talked about in lecture 1, that Sunnah in the early period meant something much more expansive and dynamic than what it later became, which is just conflated with Hadith. And then he also mentions that because after Imam Shafi'i, you had to defend any opinion that you had with Hadith, this created a proliferation of Hadith. And so you see that law, and so what he's also arguing, which I agree with, and most modern scholars do, is that Islamic law in its origin is not derived from the Hadith. Many of the opinions that have become part of Islam were actually from the local culture, but they had to be defended, so Hadith were generated in order to defend those local cultural practices. And that is how those practices became accepted by Islamic, what became, was then proto-Orthodoxy and then became Islamic Orthodoxy. So, as Halak says, quote, modern research has shown that the emergence of Hadith involved a lengthy process that involved projecting back companion and other post-prophetic narrative onto the Prophet himself. Now, I would point you to the work of Benam Siddiqui, who, by the way, I think is a phenomenal scholar. He is a preeminent Quran scholar and a Hadith scholar. Sad that, he was a former professor at Stanford, politics of tenureship. And I wonder if some, Orientalism has something to do with him not being promoted. But in any case, he writes that the image that we have of Islamic law must be turned on its head. That is, we usually think that you go to the Hadith, the Quran and the Hadith first, and then you input that into some machine, you pull the crank, and out comes a legal ruling. He says that this image needs to be turned on its head. That in fact, the laws are actually the starting point for the jurist. The end product, on the other hand, is an interpretation of that which reconciles the law with the textual sources, that is the Quran and the Prophet's sayings. The role of the methods of interpretation, therefore, is not to generate the laws, but rather to reconcile them with the textual sources. What he's saying is this is what actually happens. Yes, Usul al-Fiqh claims that it's the other way around, but if you actually look at it and do a critical analysis, usually it's the reverse process that's going on. And he gives the example of women praying next to men. So, by the way, I do want to apologize for in this course, women have been short-shifted in this course. I mean, I haven't focused on women. And one of the reasons, of course, is our own tradition that, women scholars were lacking, not due to any fault of their own, but due to the patriarchal societies that they lived in. The other point is someone did comment on, I got the message in this lecture that this kind of Persianate Islam that became dominant was really man-centered. There's no doubt about that. In fact, there is a great book by a professor, actually somebody here, I have that book somewhere here. Thought I had it on me here, but it's by Zahra Ayub, I want to say. Somebody recommended it in this, so somebody can put it in the chat, but it was a student who recommended it, and actually I realized I had it on my bookshelf, I just hadn't gotten to read it yet. But that book actually talks about how Islamic ethics has always been so gendered and what the problem is. So it's a book that I want to read. I haven't had a chance yet to do it. And I hope in a future class to do more justice to these women's issues. And hopefully in the class that we talk about modern Islamic intellectual history, I can do more justice to that. Now, so what Professor Siddiqui does is he talks about this issue of women praying next to men. As you're familiar, it's Mr. Ismail, it's not, yes, it's Zahra Ayubi. Fatima Mirnisi's work is excellent. And yes, the book is called Gendered Morality by Zahra Ayubi. and it deals exactly with Islamic ethics. Talks a lot about Imam Ghazali. I've only skimmed it, but I need to read it. But in any case, let's look at Professor Sadighi's work on the logic of lawmaking in Islam. He uses examples, and they have to do with women. We all know that I remember. I have this memory in childhood. I was a little kid. My mom was praying, and I remember thinking that it was kind of weird. She has to pray behind me. I'm her son. I'm like, 8 years old or something. I don't know how old I was at that time. And my mom has to pray behind me. Why is that? So Benam Sadighi is going to kind of explore this concept and this idea. There is this quote unquote adjacency law in Islamic law. And he's dealing with the Hanafi school of thought, but he says this can most likely be extrapolated to other madhabs as well. And he writes that this adjacency law, and what is the adjacency law? The adjacency law is that a woman, if she prays next to a man, that man's prayer is invalidated. So the man's prayer is invalidated, not the woman's prayer. So why is that? Why is a woman an invalidator of prayer if they're praying the same prayer? If they're praying side by side, or if the woman is ahead? Why is that? So what Benam Sadighi notes is that this adjacency law has its roots in certain notions about the transmission of ritual impurity that originated in Basra in Iraq in the first half of the 7th century. That is before this hadith paradigm became dominant. In this view, this local culture, women were considered perpetual ritual contaminators, and they transmit this impurity to men standing adjacent to them. That is to say, there were different views about women, whether they're pure or impure, based on menstruation. There is, all of these gendered ideas about menstruation, but there was this idea that on this view, in this Basran view, we never know if a woman is menstruating. Therefore, she's always impure by default. That was the view that they took. Now, even though this was the source of the law, Sadighi's research shows that eventually this reason for the law was forgotten, but another justification was used to keep the law. And this was the hadith that says, keep them, women, behind where God has kept them. Many other reasons historically have been cited in the Hanafi madhab. That is, later someone said that it's because sexual thoughts, men have sexual thoughts if women stand next to them or in front of them. That is to say that all of these reasons are brought to the fore, but the law stays the same. The reasons and logic to reach it, the logic of lawmaking differs, but the law remains constant. Even though this idea of this perpetual contaminating machine is no longer in Hanafi madhab, nobody uses that anymore, the law has remained static. And what Benam notes is that, quote, the fact that only the immediate layer of male worshippers surrounding a woman is affected in the Hanafi madhab, it follows because that layer forms a barrier that blocks the contamination from radiating throughout to the other worshippers. Therefore, the contamination hypothesis also explains the curious sexual asymmetry, why a woman's prayer is not invalidated, but the man's prayer is. A woman's prayer is not invalidated by adjacency to a man because men do not radiate ritual impurity. So, and he gives many other examples, by the way, but this is one of them. And they're all about women and prayer, going to the mosque. He also shows how, a hadith, which says that don't stop women from going to the mosque, it's through the passage of time, it's completely inverted. So what he argues is it's not that the source text is what drives the law, but rather it's social concerns that drive the law. And it's only once social concerns have reached a threshold point that the law can then change. That's what changes the law, not what he calls the canon blind law. That's what changes the law. And then the canon, the scriptural canon, is used to justify that change, not the other way around. And he gives at least, I think, 3 major examples that he talks about. All right. I have my own example from my dissertation is on jihad. And I would look at this verse. This verse, fight them until there is no fitna, religious persecution. Qurtubi, one of the mufassirun, he tells us that there are 2 views of this verse. One, that it's an abrogating, that is, it is an operative verse. And 2, that it is an abrogated or non-operative or non-abrogating verse. Now, if you read Islamic, the way the usul are written, you would think that they would first say, okay, let's find out which verses are abrogated and which are abrogating. By the way, abrogation, in case you don't know it, is this doctrine where they say that the later verses abrogated or canceled or nullified previous verses. It's highly controversial. It is part of the traditional paradigm, but many people in the modern period, and there have been predecessors who questioned it, but in the modern period, there's been a lot of pushback against this. And I'm one person who, I don't agree with this type of abrogation at all. But in any case, we see how this tool of abrogation is used to nullify this verse that is problematic. But we only need to use this tool of if it become it. So even by sorry, I'm rambling here, but the theory of abrogation says, the theory, not the practice, the theory says, first find out which verses came first and which came later, and then that will help you decide which verse is abrogating and which verse is abrogated. But that's not really how it went. Instead, they say we decide whether a verse is abrogated or abrogating based on what the verse tells us. If it matches up with our theological legal doctrine, then it is an abrogator. If it conflicts with it, then it's abrogated. So we see that we need to reverse this paradigm. So I'm using Benam Siddiqui's model to see how the Quran has been interpreted historically. So we see that they use this hadith to invert the meaning of that verse, and they decide what's abrogated or not abrogated based upon what the meaning of it is. So they nullify any agency to the Quran. Bottom line, what we take as Islamic, even if it is justified in and by hadith, is often derived from local Near Eastern culture. We grew up with this idea that this thing called Islam was fully packaged by the Prophet Muhammad and that it then reached us. Our job is only to get rid of any alien accretions that may have accumulated over time. Yet from the earliest moments of Islam, what it means to be Islamic meant a constant interaction of the prophetic message with the existing realities of the world, which at that time was the Arabian Near Eastern milieu. Being Islamic can never be done in a vacuum. The conflict between Islamic textualists and the rationalists or philosophers can be seen as a conflict between Islam refracted through Arabian and Near Eastern influences on the one hand, and Islam refracted through Hellenistic and Iranian high culture on the other hand. One is therefore no more Islamic than the other, except insofar as it was earlier and was able to back project itself onto the Prophet. Now, this is probably an overdrawn argument. However, I think it's a generalization that has some merit to it. I, just as much as the next guy or girl, want to understand and reclaim the Quran, and from it, the prophetic legacy on its own terms. In fact, that is central to my research. Yet I realized that throwing out everything else in our Islamic intellectual history would leave us religiously and intellectually impoverished. There have been historically two views in Islamic intellectual history. In one view, and this is unfortunately what has become dominant in the contemporary period, thanks to a number of factors. Wahhabism is one of them, the Deobandis are another. Islam is limited to the Quran and the Sunnah, really just the hadiths and the hadith paradigm, which has become dominant. Everything else is non-Islamic or even un-Islamic. Islam is seen through a purely legalistic lens, Islam as law, rules, and dogma. But in another view throughout history, we see that Muslims think that they should embrace knowledge no matter where it comes from and keep an open but critical mind. I support this latter attitude, and this whole course has tried to push you in this direction. Even if I also agree with the recent Quranic turn and the exciting possibilities it opens up. Now I'm going to quickly recap all of our lectures, give one slide to each lecture so we kind of tie this entire course together. In lecture 1, we talked about the Quran, which I think we can understand as the core or the kernel of Islam, something definitive to ground our faith in. But I think we should focus on discerning the Quranic ethical trajectory instead of being fundamentalist. One of my criticisms of the Quraniyun or the Quranist is that many of them, not all of them, they can take the same fundamentalist mindset, the literalist fundamentalist mindset that they had from the Hadith paradigm and just transfer that to the Quran. I think that's just as problematic. Furthermore, we of course need to contextualize the Quran, and you need to use those secondary historical sources to do that. You cannot read the Quran in a vacuum, so I'm not calling to that. But I think if we read the Quran in looking for its ethical trajectory, I think this is the correct way, the double movement that Professor Fazlur Rahman talks about. In lecture 2, we talked about Sunni traditionalism. We saw that Sunnah had a more dynamic and expansive understanding in its early period, and I embraced the notion of a lived tradition. I believe a disproportionate emphasis has been placed on the Hadith and Islamic law paradigms. Even so, I recognize that even in this is a deep well from which we can draw from. That is, I'm not trying to completely throw Islamic law and this entire paradigm in the garbage can. I'm only trying to question our assumptions and problematize and make us think in more complex and sophisticated ways. But I'm not trying to throw our entire Islamic law legacy in the garbage can. There's a lot in it that we can tap into, but we should do so selectively. If anything, at least to some extent, I have to appreciate the pietism and deep sincerity of the advocates of this group, if sometimes, of course, they are too zealous. And I obviously do rely on it, that is this tradition, for some basic ritualistic concerns I may have. Sometimes people hear I'm doing a PhD and will ask me this, fiqh ritualistic question. I'm like, please don't ask me, I'm the wrong person to ask. In lecture 3, we looked at Sufism. Now I'm just trying to show you how, and this, you may not agree with my take on these, but I'm just trying to show you how I'm trying to tie these things together in my own way and get some benefit from all of these strands that we have studied. And I think that will give me strength when I'm trying to apply this to the modern period or the contemporary period. So for Sufism, I write, even if I'm skeptical of mystical experience in its fullest form, and certainly of saintly intercession, miracle, and magic, I appreciate the importance of religious or spiritual experience, which may be a necessary antidote to the very cerebral and rationalistic religion that I may be guilty of espousing as a Western academic. I would love to one day have experience of dhawq, or taste of the divine, and shut out the busy materialistic world around me. I want to not just describe the wine, but taste it. But of course, I'm speaking in metaphor here. I appreciate Sufi poetry, music, and dance. I embrace certain inclusivist notions held by some Sufis, and I think the madhab of love is a good counterpoint to the rigid legalism and exclusivism of Sunni traditionalism. Apologize for my typos. In lecture 4, we talked about Shiism. From Shiism and my study of it, I appreciate the Shia emphasis on love and justice. I have come to acknowledge and appreciate the Shia viewpoints and realize that on some key issues, we simply have different usul, principles, and starting points, so we come to different conclusions. This does not mean that we can't treat each other with mutual love and respect. My differences with some Shias is certainly less than my differences with many fellow Sunnis. In fact, that's obvious. I do not consider Shiism to be other than Islam. This insight allows me to tap into the vast resources within the Shia tradition, both past and present. This is as deep a well as the Sunni one. One of my regrets is that I did not get to cover Ismaili Shiism in this course. And that's very sad. I mean, they have been deeply influential in Islamic intellectual history despite their small size. And there's really no excuse for this omission. But my own personal study of this branch of Islam, thanks to my advisor, Professor Ali Asani, and my good friend and colleague, Professor Khalil Andani, both of whom are specialists in Ismaili Islam, it has made me go from thinking that their theology is somehow goofy. That is what I had the impression of as just a layperson before I entered the academy, and I spent some time in Pakistan. So that's kind of the popular view that I unfortunately took. But after studying it, I realized that their theology is in fact quite sophisticated and advanced. Moreover, Ismailis, despite constituting a small percentage of Muslims, have been immensely influential in Islamic intellectual history. For example, my friend and dear colleague, Professor Andani, has written an article about how deeply Imam Ghazali was influenced by Ismaili philosophy. And this is undeniable. So was Ibn Sina, Avicenna, deeply influenced by Ismaili thoughts. Furthermore, in the modern period, I have a deep admiration for Agha Khan III, that's the previous Agha Khan, who modernized and liberalized his community. And I think the Ismaili Nizari model is one that we can learn from in this respect. Think about women's rights, cosmopolitanism, etc. Their women are just as educated as their men, if not more so. Now, of course, this need not be an uncritical acceptance of this trajectory. Every religious community has to traverse their own path. But I think it's a model that we can look to for inspiration and use critically. I talked to Professor Andani about it. He says, look, my community has its own problems that they're facing. But I think it's a good model that we can look to. And we do ourselves a disservice to consider them somehow non-Muslim or not truly Islamic. I think that's problematic. All right, in lecture 5, we talked about Islamic rationalism, mostly the Mu'tazilis, but we also talked about the Asharis, who are kind of the semi-rationalists. The point I want to drive home is that Mu'tazilis historically were part of the Sunni fold, even though they eventually died out and then were absorbed by Shia theology. I oppose this attempt to drive Mu'tazilis out of Sunnism. I think this should be rejected. And unfortunately, some even very good scholars talk about it as if these are two separate things, Sunnism and Mu'tazilism. It goes without saying that I am quite sympathetic to this branch of historical Islam and think that they strike the right balance between reason and religion. I think the view that we can use our human reason to attain ultimate truths of right and wrong is absolutely necessary to fight off religious dogmatism and fundamentalism. Even so, I think using the label of neo-Mu'tazilism and using this as a banner might be ahistorical and also fall into a saved sect mentality. I would much rather selectively tap into this group's legacy to explore possibilities instead of boxing myself in, especially given the gems that I see in other Islamic groups, including Asharism and even someone like Ibn Taymiyyah from the Hanbalis. You can see from my lectures that I'm a big fan of Imam Ghazali. In lecture 6, we talked about Islamic philosophy. I acknowledge this group to be the most sophisticated of our intellectual heritage, and therefore find it a travesty if we were to summarily reject it as un-Islamic. Even if I appreciate their contention that religion uses the language of symbols, metaphors, and allegory, and I think this emphasis is going to increase as we move forward. And although I find their Durkheimian view of religion to be a useful counterpoint to our current atheistic and irreligious day and age, that is to say, I see their idea of philosophical religion as a good middle way between atheism and irreligion on the one side and fundamentalism on the other side. I do think that the Islamic philosophers were wrong to think intellectual philosophy or science are in any way superior to the abiding truths of religion. And I do think we need to ask this question that we keep coming back to. What is so Islamic about the Islamic philosophers? Well, Ibn Sina himself had to answer this kind of accusation. He has this lovable quote where he says, quote, "It is not so easy and trifling a matter to call me an unbeliever. No faith is better founded than my own. I am singular in my age, and if I am an unbeliever, in that case, there's no single Muslim anywhere." Ibn Sina was legendary for his well, really arrogance, but a lot of these thinkers were. I mean, Imam Ghazali was too, if you read a lot of his work. But you can see that the point that I'm trying to make is that Ibn Sina took his Muslimness very seriously, and he was informed by his Islamicness, even if you yourself don't agree with him on many points. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So what I use as my rule of thumb as a Western academic to decide whether something's Islamic or not, I actually try to peer into the motivations of that person or that group and say, are they driven themselves by their Islamic identity? Do they self-identify that? So, for example, that's why I have a problem with Hafez. I think he's actually trying to be counter-religion, and it's not a part of his Islamicness that motivates him, but a counter-religion idea that motivates him. That's why I exclude him. Now, I may be wrong in that assessment, but I'm just trying to show you how I use this rule of thumb. So if someone tries to express their Islamicness in a certain way, whether we agree with how they do it or not, I take that to be Islamic as a Western scholar. And I think even on a theological front, I think that that's a good enough rule to consider someone a Muslim. And we can say that's an interpretation of Islam, whether we agree with it or not. A.J. Arbery, who translated a lot of Avicenna's work, he himself as a Western scholar is trying to assess this. And he says, look, at least from a non-Muslim standpoint, there's no way that I could say that Avicenna is not a Muslim or coming from an Islamic standpoint. Clearly, from his standpoint, he is Islamic. He's motivated by Islam, his Islamicness. Now, of course, he does think that God himself is the one who gave human beings reason. But just because you prioritize reason above revelation does not mean that it's not from an Islamic standpoint, your understanding of Islam, that you're doing that. This is what what Shahab Ahmad calls pretext. You might say that the pretext, which is reason, is above the text, but that's still in your worldview, your Islamic worldview. Whether you agree with it or not, by the way. In lectures 7 to 8, we talked about religion and science, and we appreciated at least 3 separate historical approaches within Islam to reconcile religion and science. And it is hoped that these tools will allow many of us to formulate our own more sophisticated approach in the present day to reconcile religion and science. I think the way that's done by many people, many Muslims today, you see it on YouTube, and I think it's not sophisticated at all. And I think going into this historical legacy that we have will make it more so. Finally, we saw that these Islamic philosophers and scientists believed that their Islam is what motivated them to pursue the sciences, that is, appreciating the art of the artisan. And so this false dichotomy between faith and science, this new atheist or anti-theist idea that faith and science are always at loggerheads, this is a myth. In lecture 9, we talked about narratives of decline. And we pushed back against this idea of seeing a narrow golden age of Islam, and after that, just decline. We saw that the vast Islamic legacy that we can tap into spans some 700 plus years, half of Islamic history, at least. We also saw that it would be foolish and misguided to portray all of Sunni orthodoxy or traditionalism as hopelessly anti-intellectual or unsophisticated. We saw how sophisticated Imam Ghazali was when it comes to religion and science. And we also, I pointed you in certain directions about how Ash'ari theologians further pursued kind of intellectual thought that we should not just poo-poo. No matter what side of the religious spectrum you fall on, I contend that all 3 trends, as represented by Ibn Rushd, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah, have something profound to offer you. Finally, I want to close with the principles of religious literacy that we started with at the start of this course. And I hope that you can see now how they really should hit home, and hopefully that I have achieved my objective. We learned that religions are not monolithic in nature, but rather are characterized by a great deal of internal diversity. That's not just Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Sunni, Shia. No, this diversity is much more profound than that. We saw that religions are not ahistorical or static, but rather they evolve and change over time. We saw that religion is intimately and inexorably tied to culture, context, and all aspects of society and life. Perhaps we could have done a better job of this. Intellectual historians are often criticized for just talking about ideas and not social history. 4, we saw that there is a difference between the devotional expression of particular religious beliefs as normative and the non-sectarian study of religion that we engaged in. Now, we did sometimes switch. We did code switch from time to time. I definitely did. But I'm trying to show you that these are 2 different ways to approach the study of religion. And finally, I want to reinforce the idea that all knowledge claims are situated, including my own. Want to reiterate the fact that when someone says Islam says, or what does Islam say about something, please problematize that. Islam does not say anything, Muslims do. And this goes back all the way to the 4th Caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib. The goals of the course that I laid out in the first lecture, I want to see if I achieved those, and I hope I did. To acquaint the student with the major Islamic groups and trends in history. Now, we didn't do the modern period. I do, by the way, have 2 lectures. I'll put it in the lecture notes. I forgot to put it in this PowerPoint. But I do have 2 lectures on the modern period, which one covers kind of the religious revivalists, kind of more the conservative side, and then another that covered the Islamic modernists. So if you wanted to, you could go and find those and get a full view of Islamic intellectual history. But I don't think I did justice to it in those 2 lectures. And that's why I'm hoping that we can join back after some break and actually do it justice through the Ghamidi Center. My other goal was to appreciate the expansive and rich diversity of Islamic thoughts and to situate contemporary religious debates and give students the tools to engage with these in a more sophisticated way. Finally, this was only the start of your and our intellectual exploration and journey. As far as reading material, today I'm going to leave you, I usually leave you with a bunch of books. Today I'm going to only leave you with 1, but it's like 600, 700 pages. And honestly, I had to read it a second time for this class, and oh my God, was that a really, he should have shortened this by 300 pages, but he can be sometimes rambling, but it is a profound book. I don't agree with all of it. I showed you some divergences that I had, but I mean, this is a profound book, and it does guide me. Finally, please stay in touch. We'll do the get-together, email, Facebook, Twitter that we talked about, YouTube. And finally, I wanted to talk about my YouTube show that I'm planning this summer. It's tentatively going to be called The Religion Report, but basically we're going to talk about, it's going to be a space, if you've seen Religion Dispatches, which is a website for, mostly for Western academics who want to engage in public discourse. I'm trying to do that on YouTube. That's the goal. So it won't just be a space for Islam or Islamic studies, but it'll be for the study of religion as broadly interpreted. And it won't just be religious studies. It will also be a safe space for academic theology. But basically, I'm trying to push back against two extremes that I see that are kind of dominant right now in social media and YouTube, which is one is kind of the religious fundamentalists. A lot of the stuff, the Muslim response to this, Muslim reaction to this, the people who are doing this are fundamentalists, most of them. I'm sorry to say they really are. And that's the only side that's being represented. And then on the other side, you have the kind of the anti-theists or new atheists, this faux intellectualism that I want to push back against as well. None of them are scholars of religion. They don't know the first thing about religion, history, philosophy, anything. They're mostly people who come from science backgrounds, which is fine, but don't think you're an expert then in this material. So that's what I'm planning on doing. I don't have a URL yet. I haven't done this. It'll probably be in the next month or so, but keep an eye out for it. So follow me on Twitter and Facebook. I have 0 followers right now, so you can be the first. I literally just started this before this class. And so these are my acknowledgments that I already did. And now we have about 15 more minutes. So you can now leave if you want to. If you have questions, this is a good time to ask. But I did want to, because it is so controversial, I do want to talk about this issue of Quranic preservation. You don't need to stick around if you don't want to. It's kind of a random topic to throw in, but I did want to use the platform to do it. So any questions right now before we get into it? Dr. Dean, go ahead.
Can I make a Baji comment too before I ask my question? I've just really thoroughly enjoyed this. Yeah, I'm gonna embarrass you. But I remember Daddy always brings up how you used to come up to my shoulder, and then there was that moment where you crossed and you became taller than me.
Let's edit this out, please.
SubhanAllah, I'm so proud of you, and I really appreciate all the effort you put in. And the fact that I learned from my little brother is a real gift, alhamdulillah. But my question is...
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for everything you've done for this course and your guidance and activism. I really appreciate it.
So, at the end of the day, while all this intellectual exercise is wonderful, we then have to implement, in our daily lives. And a lot of that is challenging when we have to share space in our Islamic centers and Muslim spaces. So I know you said not to ask you fiqh questions, so I'm not asking a fiqh question, but I'm asking, for example, the issue of women being allowed space in the mosque, right? And especially as masajid are answering the question of, as they reopen, how they can plan for that. And so the Quran, I was really surprised to learn that in Surah Jumu'ah, it calls people who believe to pray Jumu'ah to take time aside from their week to pray together in congregation. Now, when you share this or bring this up for questioning and conversation, you will immediately be shut down with, sister, you can't use one Quranic ayah out of context. There's a bigger discussion to be had. Leave this to the scholars. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that redirection. And I am curious as to how that evolved. What is it that moves us away from the Quranic ayah to the way it's implemented today in our spaces?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. So what I would say is this: as far as the Quran itself is concerned, as you and I both know, the Quran is deeply concerned with vulnerable populations, one of which is women. That's undeniable. But unfortunately, because of Islamic history, the way it unfolded, they were deeply patriarchal cultures. And the Arabian, I think, to be very frank, I know we say it in apologetics, we say that Islam improved the condition of women. I do think that the Quran sought to do that, but I have to tell you that I think Islamic history shows that the condition of women, in my opinion, got worse as Islam became empire. And this is because of this combination with this Persianate and kind of culture. And the Persianate culture had a lot of great things that I appreciate and want to extract. But I do think that it was highly gendered. And perhaps that book that we referred to will shed some more light on that. As far as my specific view about women praying, what I would say is this: I think that we need to have one foot in the tradition and move forward slowly and carefully and methodically. I think if we move too quickly, we risk, becoming negligible in the discourse. Now, I'm not trying to say that we don't want women to pray side by side. That's not what I'm saying by that. But what I'm saying is that so Professor Amina Wadud, who I very much respect, she took that bold step to do that mixed congregation. But I think one of the errors that she made, or at least that I saw from the pictures, was that it was literally a mixed congregation where men and women were standing shoulder to shoulder. So you conflated two issues. One issue was, and I think one of the fears that even I have of moving forward, and I realize that some of my work may end up 100 years from now being one factor in this path that I don't want to tread, is I think we see how the Western world kind of devolved into an embrace of libertinism, which is this embrace of sexual immorality and fahashi. I think that is what people are fearful of as Muslims. And so when you have this mixed congregation of men and women and not taking this seriously, I think that was too many steps all in one go. And whether or not you even want that, I think it would have been sufficient to have had men and women side by side with a respectful barrier, not that women are behind at all. I think that was probably the way to do it. That's just my personal opinion. As far as how to answer that question that somebody's pushing back, I think it is the religious intellectuals who need to give you and everyone else the ammunition to go out and respond toe to toe with those people who are just repeating what their ulama and scholars are saying. So I do think that the responsibility is kind of more spread out, as I would say. So the way I would say it is, I could be somebody who could help articulate it, and you who's more on the ground, I just sit in a room and think things and don't do anything. You, on the other hand, people who know Dr. Dean's work, my sister, she's really out there putting herself in the community, doing all this social work that's quite amazing. So I think you are the one who can then implement it. So I think that's how I see the division of labor. So thank you for that question. All right, now let's quickly get into this. And anyone who wants to leave, please, if you're interested in this topic, please stick around. It's just an extra bonus section. So we're talking about the Quran, and I am a proponent of the historical critical method. What is the historical critical method? It's to interpret a literary document critically. To interpret a literary document critically means to suspend inherited presuppositions about its origin, transmission, and meaning. This is, by the way, why I don't use honorifics in these lectures. Many of you may have wondered why I don't use them. For example, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, radiyallahu anhu. You may find that disrespectful, but really, I use those in my personal life, but I don't use them when I'm giving lectures in either an academic lecture or even an academic theological lecture. I don't use those honorifics. Whether you agree with that or not, that is my approach. The principle, okay, so the first thing is to the historical critical method. We talked about what it means to be critical. What does it mean to be historical? It's to use this principle of historical analogy. That is to say that we assume that for the most part, past periods of history follow the same general rules that we follow in the present age. So this idea that we have that the Sahaba were all perfect and didn't commit any sins, and okay, maybe that's too much of a stretch. No one really says that. But this idea that they were somehow super special and supermen or superhuman, that the historical critical method would not think is acceptable. So historical criticism, in other words, is a radical way, quite a risky one to be sure, of truly letting oneself be addressed by scripture. So here, by the way, Nikolai Sinai, who wrote this, is arguing that a believer can actually use the historical critical method. And by using the historical critical method, it's risky for sure, but it actually, in one way, you're allowing scripture itself to speak. And in that way, you can actually be more true to the Quran or scripture itself. And he says that many Jews, Christians, and Muslims may find, and indeed have found, this historical critical method stimulating and enriching from a theological perspective. Now, I do point you to this article by Professor Fred Donner, who is a lovely human being and a great scholar of Islamic studies. He wrote this book, this article, The Historian, the Believer, and the Quran. And he's basically asking, does this historical critical method, will it throw any Muslims' core beliefs into crisis? Can you even be a Muslim studying early Islamic history or the Quran? Well, he points out, even if you found he's just doing a thought experiment here. Even if you found a video cassette, a historical record of a video cassette that showed the Prophet Muhammad reading in his library the old religious books of other religions and then composing the Quran, even if you historically found this evidence. Now, obviously it's ridiculous, but he's just trying to hammer home the point. He's like, none of this would say that you can't be a believing Muslim. He says, perhaps God's chosen method, at least in this case, this hypothetical scenario, was to select a person to be his prophet, then to put in the path of that person a variety of suggestive texts, and finally to inspire the prophet to assemble the revelation from them. In fact, he goes to an even more stretched thought experiment where he says, what if we had a videotape in which we saw that the prophet was constructing the Quran by reading the back of cereal boxes? Would that necessarily mean that you can't believe in the Quran? Now, he was trying to make the point that even then you could be okay with that. I actually had lunch with him one day and I told him that example, even though I appreciate what you were trying to draw home, probably that would break the camel's back. And he agreed and laughed. But the point is that what we find through the historical critical method doesn't necessarily break our religion and faith. And this is important because we talked about this at the end of last lecture, so it's proper that we talk about it at the end of this lecture. Now, if your religious faith and commitments are very rigid and you're very dogmatic, then yes, it will cause your faith commitments to crumble. But if you're willing to go where the information takes you, then I do not think at all it will make your faith your faith structure collapse. In fact, for me, it has only strengthened my faith, and someone else mentioned that in the previous lecture. Even so, I think it does require the believer to be either flexible in her faith and unlearn many of the things we were indoctrinated in, or else to compartmentalize. I think a lot of people do the compartmentalization. That is, they have their faith commitments on one side and then their academic historical mind on the other. But I think the latter approach runs the risk of cognitive dissonance, so I don't endorse it, but it's definitely something that can be done. Now, it should be, why is this historical critical method risky? Well, it's the same approach that was used in biblical studies. And after this kind of historical critical method was used, the Bible, which was thought to have certain authors historically, that belief kind of fell apart. And we found that the Bible was actually the product of a multi-generational process of growth and accretion. That is, it had multiple authors, there were some missing books, etc. So all of these problems. Now, did that cause Christianity to collapse? It did not. Trust me, it did not. In fact, all it meant was that Christian theologians had to become more sophisticated in their thinking. Now, with that in mind about what happened to the Bible, let's ask, is the same thing happening with Islam? All right, so we're going into some dangerous waters. So, don't worry, I'm going to take you through them. All right, so in the 1970s, there was this extreme wave of extreme revisionism started by John Waynesboro in his Quranic studies and the sectarian milieu. He basically argued that the Quran actually wasn't composed in Arabia, but rather in Mesopotamia and Syria, and that it came together 200 years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is way after our traditional understanding. Patricia Crone and Michael Cook at the same time published their book Hagerism, in which they said that the Quran was a product of North Arabian or Southern Syrian environments, rather than of Mecca. Basically, and I'm talking tongue in cheek here, on their view, we know that the Quran was written either to the east, west, north, or south. Sorry, that was a typo there. Just not in Mecca or Medina itself. We don't know where, just not here. Now, we as Muslims could have thrown the towel in the 1970s and said this is too dangerous of this historical critical approach. But in reality, further research has pushed back such extreme revisionist accounts and actually pulled us very close to the traditional account of the compilation of the Quran. A friend and colleague of mine, Suleiman Dost, who's a professor, he actually did his dissertation on, and it's entitled An Arabian Quran. It's quite a funny story, actually. He comes from Turkey, and he says he comes from a rural part of Turkey. So he was visiting his family, who I believe he told me that he's the first that's college educated. I might be wrong, but he's the first definitely to get a PhD, and he comes from a very rural family. And they asked him, so you've spent so many years, he's about to graduate with his dissertation, and they asked him what his dissertation topic is, his parents. And he says, oh, I showed that the Quran was composed in Arabia. And then his parents looked at him dumbfounded, and they were like, it took you 7 years to figure that out? We knew that all this whole time. Why did you waste 5 years of real? The point is that this work that's being done in the Western Academy is really crucial. And it's not just by non-Muslims, it's by Muslims as well. And this idea that somehow non-Muslims are neutral and have no access to grind, it's completely false. A lot of this earlier work, Hagerism and definitely Waynesboro, it's seeped with anti-Islamic sentiment. Now, I'm going to push you a little bit right now. I'm going to ask you this question. How many verses are in the Quran? The standard answer is 6,236 verses. All right. What if I told you that some Qurans had more or less verses, sometimes a difference in the dozens or hundreds? Are you shocked? Has your faith fallen apart? In fact, it's just a different numbering scheme. All of the text is still the same, but historically, you may not have known this because, again, we are raised in a certain traditional simplified doctrine. We're honestly indoctrinated in it. And then when certain complexities are revealed to us that our scholars have always known, you can read any book of Quranic sciences, it'll tell you that there were many different systems of numbering the Quran, numbering the verses of the Quran. And based on how you number the Quran, for example, whether you consider the Bismillah a separate verse, you'll have a different number of verses. So even though I gave you that shock value by saying you got all these other Qurans with other hundreds of missing or extra verses, in reality, when you study it, you realize, oh, okay, I just needed to know this extra fact that something that we always knew, Muslim scholars knew, that there are these different numbering systems. The moral of this story is that your potential initial shock is due only to you, and I'm saying we, having been indoctrinated by a simplified teaching and not being aware of the differences of opinion, well known, in this case, by our own scholars throughout Islamic history. Shifting your belief on this issue does not, or at least it should not, shatter your entire belief system. So take heart. You may have come to the belief on your own, or somebody may have told you this, that the numbering system is divine and there's no dispute about it. But when you study it, no, it's actually a little bit more complex. None of this should shatter your belief system. So I'm kind of putting your toe into the water now. I'm going to push you a little further now. There is some doubt as to whether or not the first surah in the Quran, Surah Fatiha, and the last two were to be considered a part of the Quran proper, or whether they were du'as, divine invocations, to be read before and after the Quran. Either way, whichever view you took, they were mandatory to read, and they were essential reading. And so no matter which view you took on this issue, it has no practical effect on your belief as to whether surah, whether you take it as an intrinsic part of the Quran or a divine invocation to be read before starting the Quran, it has no effect. Now, I do take the view that these are part of the Quran. But what I'm trying to tell you is that this difference of opinion should not shatter your belief system. Think about if this is problematic to you, think about the Bismillah. The first, there's a debate about whether the Bismillah, the first one in Surah Fatiha, is a part of Surah Fatiha in the Quran or not. Whether it is or not, does that affect the fact that we should recite the Bismillah, that it's a part of our religion? So why should this shatter your faith? Now, I did all of that to get you into the water. Now you're you're chest high into the water now. So hopefully the temperature is, you're no longer chilled. You've reached equilibrium with the water's temperature. So now you're ready to address this topic of Quranic variants. Hopefully you've heard about, hopefully or not, it's everywhere now on social media and YouTube. People are making a big deal. Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, this whole controversy over the Quranic variants. So we can no longer hide and not share these things. So another simplified belief we were indoctrinated in is the idea, this very strong claim, that no two Qurans differ in a single letter or dot. Remember what I told you in a previous lecture. When you're making a claim, try to make as humble a claim as you can, because then you can defend it. The stronger the claim you make, the more chance it can be falsified, right? So when we came up with this idea that no two Qurans differ in a single letter or dot, that was not a wise idea to make such a strong claim. Our scholars have always understood that there are in fact different recitations of the Quran, the qira'at, and these things called modes, or harf is the singular, or ihruf is the plural. So do not be disheartened by the idea that manuscripts are now being discovered that reveal Quranic variants. This was well known to all Islamic scholars. You read any basic text of Quranic sciences, you will find this idea in it. Even so, despite the fact that Islamic scholars have always recognized these Quranic variants, it is true that their theories to explain these fail us. And I put this in quotes because I think these are the words that Sheikh Yasir used, and I agree with him. And these theories need to be revised. The point is the scholars recognize that these variants exist. Their explanation for them was a little problematic, and we'll talk about it, but they knew that they existed. So this shouldn't shatter your faith. Now, I pointed out that Sheikh Yasir Qadhi recently, quote, got into trouble for saying this in an interview, but I agree with him. I, of course, don't agree with his later Facebook clarification, which I think is kind of walking this back. But nonetheless, I understand what pressures he's under. Now, a lot of Islamophobes jumped on his words, and certain followers of his, or ex-followers of his, kind of jumped on him as well, which I think shows that this trend of Islamic thought, Hanbalism, is quite problematic. It eats its own. And so I think they should take this to heart and realize that they're creating an unhealthy intellectual culture. Now, Christian apologists, Islamophobes, most of them Christian apologists, have jumped on Sheikh Yasir's words and the issue of Quranic variants to attack Islam. My response. What I will say is this: the variants are not a big deal at all and do not in any way impugn the historical reliability of the Quran. In fact, they strengthen the case for the text's historical reliability. I can clarify this later if you want. Keep in mind that these same people who are now making a big fuss of these variants, in the 1970s, they were arguing for the idea that the Quran was written up to 200 years after the Prophet, and it was written in Mesopotamia, Syria, etc. All of that has gone to the wayside, and we are now back to an Arabian Quran that was a closed text relatively early on. So the reason why I have this picture, by the way, if anyone recognizes this, is this. That's Khabib Nurmagomedov, who is the undefeated UFC fighter, perhaps the best UFC fighter ever. He is Muslim, by the way, so it's wajib to support him, and I'm a big fan of him. And he's beating Conor McGregor. And Conor McGregor was a hyped up fighter, racist fighter, by the way, who the media, MMA media hyped up, and then he got destroyed by Khabib. Even though he talked all this trash, talked against Khabib's father, his religion, his culture, etc. Now, Khabib destroyed him. There was not even a question. It was a lopsided affair. You know what the media was saying afterward that was pro Conor McGregor and his fans? They were saying, yeah, but Conor won one round. I don't even think he won one round. But in a five-round fight, you're talking about one round that you may have won, and it's a question if you won. They were saying, oh, Conor got some good shots in. Why I'm trying to make this analogy is, really, when it comes to this issue of the historical reliability of the Quran, the people, these Christian apologists, and not all Christians are like this, certainly not, not even all apologists are like this, but those who are making a big deal of these Quranic variants, they're Conor McGregor, okay? Their theories have gone to the wayside, and now all they're falling onto or latching onto are this very minor Quranic variants, which we'll give some examples of. Even so, the truth is that, in my opinion, we Muslims should never have engaged in such heated polemical debates to begin with. That is, assailing the Bible and Christianity. We don't appreciate it when people do it to us. Why were we doing it to them? So that's why I've been very consistent that I don't appreciate this kind of Zakir Naik style of debating. It seems to me that this extreme position that we Muslims have reached, that no two Qurans differ in even a single dot or letter, is probably a very modern phenomenon, linked to our polemical engagement with Christians. In any case, they would be quite right in pointing to our hypocrisy here. So I'm giving them that point. Having said that, I think it would be a counter myth. So if the myth is that so the myth that Muslims were propagating, or Muslim apologists were propagating, was the idea that no two Qurans are different in even a letter or a dot, and then using this to bash Christians over the head with and bash the Bible. That's the myth, because they were saying that the Bible, look at how its textual transmission is so problematic. So that's the myth. Unlike that, our Quran is, 100%, A+ kind of thing. This was kind of the myth. But I think it would be a counter myth to say that the transmission history of the Quran and the Bible are equally problematic. Remember, the Bible is considered a multi-generational, multi-author text, many of the hands being unknown. There's missing books, etc. When it comes to the Quran, all even Daniel Brubaker, who his recent book shows, are extremely minor variations that do not radically affect the meaning of the text, let alone having any theological import. And we're going to talk about Dr. Brubaker very shortly. He's making a name for himself. Here are some examples of variants. Now, this might shake you and tremble your faith. I don't think it should, okay? In the middle column, you have the text of the standard tradition. And in the right-hand side, you have the text that was found in the manuscript, that was, the Sana manuscript that was found, that was uncovered. And this is a very early manuscript, a pre-Uthmanic manuscript. So now they're comparing the underlayer of that is a pre-Islamic text with the standard text that we have now. Look at the first one. You can't even tell the difference most of the time. The standard text that we have now says, do not shave your heads until the offering reaches its destination. The text in what they call the C1 text, which is that underlying pre-Uthmanic text, says, do not shave until the offering reaches its destination. Is there any change in meaning? No. If any of you be sick, that's the other example. Should any of you be sick? Oh my God, my whole faith is shattered. The third example, there's a missing word, but really it's kind of an extra redundant word anyways. Fasting or alms or an offering. Well, an offering is a type of alms, so really this is not quite anything shattering. And here are two more examples. You can go in the notes yourself. I mean, I had a hard time to even see what the difference was. I had to use underlining to figure it out. Now, what are these variants? So let's quickly go over these. These are the differences that you'll see in the variants. The first one is, and this is from an article from Yassine Dutton, and Yassine Dutton is the one who I think is the pioneer of this topic as far as academic theology, and we'll talk about him. But here are the differences that we see in these variant readings. One is a simple difference of pronunciation. So that's, English, American pronunciation versus British pronunciation. Kafirun versus kafirun, right? That's not a major difference. Number two is differences of pronunciation involving a short vowel, which have no effect on the skeletal. So the example they give is, these are minimal changes, if anything. Instead of preserved on a tablet, you have on a preserved tablet. Is that a major difference? No. Number three, differences of pronunciation involving a long vowel. And we all know this example. I'm sure many of you do. Malik and Malik in Surah Fatiha, king or owner. They don't have a major difference. In fact, it's kind of nice that you have both of them. Number four, and there are 5 of them that he lists. Number 4 is, these are a little bit stronger. There are differences in, but they have minimal changes to the meaning. So for example, he tells versus he decides the truth. He it is who makes you travel versus spreads you around the land and the sea. That is the active versus the passive voice. Helpers of Allah or be helpers of Allah, Allah's helpers. So the differences are very minor. And then 5, you finally have you can see instead of race each other, you have and race each other. These are very minimal. I mean, it's even hard to see what the differences really are. Professor Dutton's conclusion is, as can be seen, all of these differences are differences on the micro level and make little or no difference to the basic meaning. Now, we do have to look at the traditional theory. The traditional theory, this is written by Yasser Qadhi in a book that he wrote. We only have a few more slides. I apologize for going over time. Like I said, this is a super important topic. Professor Qadhi wrote this book before he changed his view on the topic. This is when he was in his kind of Salafi phase. And it's a really good book that he wrote, by the way. It's a really good book in English if you want to know the traditional Islamic science as far as the Quran is concerned. So the traditional view is that all of these different ahruf, and ahruf are translated as modes, different readings, these are all directly from Allah. That is the key point. They are from Allah and not from the companions. And by the way, in the tradition, they differentiate between the ahruf and the qira'at. The qira'at are the recitations. That you can just, you could just say it's mostly pronunciations and stuff and the way you recite, but you can't say that about the ahruf. As we saw, those have a lot more differences that are not just pronunciation. And we saw the 5 different, some of them more pronunciation, some of them more a slight changing in wording. Now, according to the traditional theory, Allah or Gabriel is said to have revealed the Quran directly to the Prophet in one harf, or one way, and then in a subsequent 6 more ways, or ahruf. So these ahruf are all directly tied to Allah or Gabriel. And another explanation that's given is that these ahruf were because of the various dialects of the Arab tribes or clans. So these were based on the regional differences that Allah or the Prophet wanted to allow the Quran to be understandable to all these different people with different dialects. And Yasser Qadhi, Sheikh Yasser writes, and this is his view from before, quote, the wisdom in the various ahruf was to facilitate the memorization of the Quran. Since the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, this greatly eased its memorization and was a way of making the preservation and propagation of the Quran easier. So this is the traditional justification. Now, we're going to use the historical critical method to see, does this really stand the test? Here are the hadiths that are used to justify this idea that the Quran was revealed in 7 harfs or 7 modes. Jibril in this hadith, for example, is said to have recited the Quran first in 1 harf, and then the Prophet himself asked that it be recited in another harf, then another harf, then another harf. So here the Prophet is the one who's requesting this. In this other hadith, however, it's Gabriel who is doing the commanding and saying that you need to recite the Quran in these multiple different harfs. So first Gabriel commands, that says that God commands it in 1 harf, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then eventually 7 harfs. Then in a third hadith, we see that there is some conflict between these first 2 hadith, by the way. Now in this third hadith, we have 2 of the Sahabas. This is a key hadith, so pay attention right now. So you have Umar ibn al-Khattab and another companion, Hisham ibn Hakim, who get in this debate. They get into a conflict. They go into loggerheads because one of them is reciting the Quran in one way, and then the other is saying, how dare you recite it that way? You're reciting the Quran incorrectly. And then they both go to the Prophet. They rush to the Prophet, and the Prophet says, okay, you recite. He asks one of them to recite the Quran, and after that person recites that verse, the Prophet says, yes, that is how it was revealed. It was revealed this way. Then he asks the other companion to do the same. He recites it in a different way, and then the Prophet nods and says, yes, it was revealed in this way. And he says, indeed, the Quran has been revealed. This is the Prophet now. Indeed, the Quran has been revealed in 7 different ahruf, so recite whichever one is easy for you. So again, this is all used to get this traditional theory. Well, what are some of the problems? As even recognized by some of our own classical scholars, the tribal dialect explanation doesn't make sense. Umar and Hisham disagreed about how to recite the surah, but both were from the Quraysh. Sorry for the typo. In other words, they disagreed about the details, although they were both from the same tribe and spoke the same dialect. So this dialect excuse does not work. Furthermore, it seems difficult to hold that there are only 7 modes or ahruf to explain away all of the variants we discover in the various reports that scholars are now looking to and the manuscripts that we are discovering. Of course, one could say that it was not a literal 7 being referred to, but this means that there is a problem with the literal wording of the hadiths on the topic. Now, of course, the word 7 is often used, 7, 70, 700, etc., is used for, 7 is used for several, 70 is a little bit more, 700 is used for a lot, 7. So it is used in that way in Arabic. But the way the hadith itself is reported, that might be difficult to take at least the hadith literally. As Yasir Qadi concludes, and this is in his old text, the number of ahruf is exactly 7, not more, not less. This is according to the most traditional view. There are more problems. If it was Allah or Gabriel who recited these 7 ahruf to the Prophet, and then the Prophet is the one who propagated the Quran in these various modes, how does this facilitate the memorization of the Quran or help in its preservation and propagation? The obvious, non-credulous, the emperor is wearing no clothes response would be to say, no, this actually makes things much more difficult and confusing. That is, how to sort out these various recitations and readings, the infighting of the Sahaba themselves over it, and the obvious point that the first 4 caliphs immediately move to eliminate these differences and unite upon one standardized text. Most importantly, it strains credulity to say that all of these dozens and hundreds of variations come straight from the Prophet. The easier explanation, at least from the Western historical academic perspective, is that these variations came later down in the chain of transmission. Now, Dr. Shehzad Salim, as someone already mentioned in the comments, has a great interview. He actually did he's a Al-Mawrid scholar, and he's a great gentleman. I've met him before. I consider him a friend. He did his whole dissertation, his PhD dissertation on this issue, and he's published a book that's like this thick on this topic, so I encourage you to read it. He has a more, public discourse that you can view in this interview that he has with Mufti Abu Layth. Mufti Abu Layth has this show called Mind Trap, which I strongly encourage you to subscribe to, where he discusses topics that are kind of neglected in our Islamic discourse. And so Dr. Salim does explain his viewpoint, and this is Ghamidi Saab's viewpoint in this interview. Now, by the way, I have to be honest, I was impressed by this dissertation and Professor Salim's work, but it's not the view that I take. I take the view that Mufti Abu Layth takes in this interview, so you can watch this interview to see these 2 different views. But according to Dr. Salim and his view, only the recitation of Hafs an Asim, that is the common reading that the vast majority of Muslims use, that 95% of the Muslim world uses today, is the correct one that is traced back to the prophets. The other readings are due to either in their various causes, but either due to the earlier revelatory sequences given to the prophets that are no longer applicable, or their explanations of the Sahaba themselves, that is when they were doing tafsir or commentary of the Quran, and they were using synonymous words to explain various words of the Quran that were then allegedly confused with the Quran itself. And then the mixing up of passages by certain readers, and even some were due to fabrication, just like hadiths were fabricated. So this view has the strength that it basically allows you to retain your view of the common reading that's used by all of us, and say that that is to the dot indisputable, and all of the other recitations were due to these various reasons, and really we shouldn't use them. I take honestly the view of Professor Yasin Dutton, but you should make your own assessment. Professor Yasin Dutton is a believing and practicing Muslim. He's also in the Western Academy. He is in a South African university, I believe. But the article that I would urge you to read is Orality, Literacy, and the 7 Ahruf Hadith. He wrote this all the way back in 2011, so I think he was a pioneering scholar on this topic. I believe it is the emerging view of Muslims in the Western Academy, those who are engaged or even thinking about this idea of academic theology. It's held by not only Professor Dutton, but also by Professor Shabir Ali, Mufti Abu Layth, myself, and honestly several others. I just can't name names because I don't have the permission to reveal their names. Professor Dutton concludes that what is apparent is that this level of variation, this Quranic variation, does not in any way indicate a loose, unfixed text, or that there was ever more than one Quran, but rather, in the light of contemporary orality theory, that the Quran is essentially a multi-form text, such as one would expect with a text that is manifested in a society where the oral, rather than the written, was the norm. I will explain this, don't worry. Mufti Abu Layth uses a really nice word, he uses the word dynamic. The Quran was from its inception dynamic. Now, so this is from Professor Dutton's article where he's quoting Professor Fred Donner. He is doing it critically, where Professor Fred Donner is saying that, yes, Western scholars would love to find the Ur Quran or the Ur text. What is an Ur text? It's a text that it was the original. We don't have the original now, but we can try to reconstruct some original text that was the first historical text. But what Professor Dutton concludes after the quote you see in the bottom, quote, "It will be clear from our deliberations above that not only is this not possible, but also that it is not necessary and that it doesn't make sense to search for this supposed Ur text." I'm going to give you an example. Now, it's a somewhat crass example, but really I have to use it because we no longer have an oral culture. One of the few examples that I can think of where we have an oral culture still is stand-up comedy. So when it comes to stand-up comedy, I remember this one time when I actually listened to this stand-up comic. He gave, it was amazing. It was hilarious. And then he actually forgot that he already visited our school, and he came back the next year. So almost the same exact audience and the same exact comic, and he gave the exact same stand-up routine as he gave the year before. Now, it was embarrassing for him that he gave the same one because people weren't laughing as much. But what I noticed was that even though it was just a year apart, it wasn't exactly the same. You didn't use word for word, verbatim, the same material. It was almost the same, but it was a little bit different. And that actually adds to its dynamism because he was kind of tweaking it a little bit for the audience that he now had, right? So if you watch stand-up comics, they'll use the same material. In their head, it's exactly the same. But when they articulate it, it comes out with slight variations, no matter which time they give it. Now, could you ever say, and this is Dave Chappelle, could you ever say when he's giving the same bit many times over the course of his life, imagine if now you were a Dave Chappelle scholar later in life, and you wanted to find the Ur text of Dave Chappelle. Which one would you use? Would you use his first time he delivered it? Would you use his last time he would deliver it? There really is no Ur text. It's nonsensical to talk about it. Rather, this is the way oral texts are transmitted. They exist in a very different way than our written form does. The example that Professor Dutton uses is of music. He talks about a musician who gave a song 20 years earlier, and then he was asked to repeat it. It didn't come out exactly alike. It was the same song, same meaning, same everything, but there were still some tweaks and variation. I think this will help you understand what these scholars are arguing about the Quran. And to cite proof, they would cite this hadith, and Professor Dutton cites this hadith, where it's the same story where these Sahabis are arguing over which verse of the Quran, which recitation is correct or not. And they conclude we can't both be right and correct. And then the Prophet replies, the Quran was sent down to me and I was asked according to one harf or two, according, etc., etc. This until we reach 7 harfs. All of them are acceptable as long as you don't mix up an ayah of mercy with an ayah of punishment, or an ayah of punishment with an ayah of mercy. If the verse ends with mighty and wise, Azizun Hakim, and you say Samiun al-Alim, all hearing and all knowing, then Allah is all hearing and all knowing. That is to say, a good chunk of the Quran uses these formulaic phrases. If you interpose them, the Prophet himself in this narration did not, so we are today scandalized if we see this, but if we see that the Prophet he didn't mind this, according to this narration and other narrations too. That is to say, he was like, just focus on the meaning. This necessity to focus on exactly every dot and period, it seems to be a later development, especially it's even worse in the modern period. In another hadith, we see that, again, this idea that just don't change the meaning of the Quran. Minor synonymous wording is okay, according to this view. In other words, the Prophet seems to have been less of a dogmatist on exact wording and instead focused on the meanings of the Quran, which, as I have argued earlier, we, in any case, have tended to ignore. Some come, and this is Professor Dutton, who writes, quote, and this explains the Quranic variance, by the way. Some companions were reciting parts of the revelation using the same sort of variation that they had heard and witnessed the prophet using and allowing others to use, and which they thus assumed they had ongoing prophetic authority for. It is presumably on this basis that we hear of various companions allowing some limited synonym variation. It is also reasonable that, the third caliph, Uthman, sought to minimize these differences, especially given the move from an oral tribal society to a written and book culture. Moreover, with the expansion of the Islamic Empire, it no longer seemed a good idea to just infinitely allow a synonymizing. If we take this view, you don't have to, but I'm just putting it forward. If you can definitely take Dr. Salim's views on this, and you can even take the traditional view. So there's three views that you can take on this. Neither of these three views means that you need your faith to collapse. Now, if we take the third view that I take, is it a big deal? As my field advisor pointed out to me, these minor wording differences are actually much smaller than the interpretive differences we already have over the meanings of various Quranic verses. That is to say, the same Quranic verses are used, for example, to justify free will and to negate it. Furthermore, the Quranic promise that Allah will preserve the Quran, it still holds true. Some traditionalists may want to reach for their takfir guns now, but really, should they be the ones talking? They themselves abrogate or nullify dozens and dozens of verses from the Quran. They claim also that there was an ayat al-rajam, a verse of stoning that is missing from the Quran. They talk about a goat eating verses of the Quran. These to me seem to be greater insults to the Quranic integrity. I think biting the bullet makes sense. I find biting the bullet to be more intellectually consistent, and it brings a great many benefits. That is, it inoculates us from any possible damage, quote unquote, from the Western historical critical method bearing down on the Quran. Quite simply, it fits the data. Furthermore, I think it is more problematic to claim that all of the other Quranic readings are incorrect and unacceptable. Have Muslims in various parts of the world been reading something other than the Quran for many long generations and even to the present day? Now, one could certainly still hold on to the traditional narrative and keep claiming that any variants go back directly to the Prophet and are a part of the 7 ahruf, or that they are simply errors. But I think the problem is that it strains credibility, especially if you're a Western scholar deeply studying this topic. I agree that we should only use the common reading today and that we should not synonymize anymore, because the early Muslim caliphs exerted great efforts to get it right. It was a very conscientious endeavor to preserve the Quran, and they did a fantastic job of it. In fact, traditionalists like to say that the hadith were a similar mechanism was used, and if you criticize the hadith, you're criticizing the Quran. I think this is a slander against the Quran. Really, the Quran, right from the get-go after the Prophet's death, there was a concerted effort to preserve the Quran, and we see the results now. Furthermore, I do think that if we're going to bite the bullet, we may have to reconsider our views of prophecy. This is why perhaps the traditionalists don't want us to bite the bullet. So yeah, I understand that, and I understand where they're coming from. But if you're interested in that, I refer you to my colleague and friend, Professor Khalil Andani. He has his whole dissertation topic on this, where he says that this idea that we have now of that Muslims view the Quran as literally God's word as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, and that in case you didn't realize that the Quran is in Arabic, so God speaks Arabic. He says this is an oversimplified and historically incorrect view of the Islamic tradition. In fact, it's much more vast than that. And I think we could look back at Ibn Sina's work on this, but even some of the Kalam theologians, even the Ash'ari theologians, have some profound ideas that we shouldn't poo-poo and we should look back to. If you want to talk about this, since his dissertation is not published, there's a YouTube talk that he has that you can watch. I agree with a lot of the first half of it. I disagree with some of the second half of it, but please do keep an open mind. Finally, and this is my last slide, I don't know if you've seen Daniel Brubaker's work. Let's be real. Where is he coming from? I looked at his website. Is it a coincidence that he seems to be a Trump supporter? He supports Brexit. He seems to be possibly a neocon. He opposes the Iran deal. Which is, and I'm going to take a wild guess and say that he is a firm Zionist, Israeli, pro-Israeli supporter, anti-Palestinian. I'm just going to take a wild guess and guess that. So you see that this idea that Western academics are somehow neutral and objective is just quite simply false. And anyways, so there's a reason why Dr. Brubaker is pushing out this kind of material. Now, having said that, I've read this book. I have this book with me. It's right behind me. I read it. Don't you worry. They were all 20 of these corrections that he mentions are literally either just using the word hua, which is he, or using the word of God. Like that was the difference. A pronoun or using the actual name. These were the kind of differences that he was talking about. Very minor. We saw all of these already in my talk. So none of this should shatter your faith. I do think that we have some fault in the fact that we took this extreme position and used it to bash Christians over the head with. We shouldn't have done that. But you should be rest assured that no matter what three views you take, the traditional view, Dr. Salim's view, which is Ghamidi Saab's view, or the view that I've put forward, your faith should not fall apart. Any questions, please go ahead. And then we'll call it. And I know we went way over.
Javed, thank you so much for an awesome lecture as always. How are you?
It's Javad.
I'm sorry?
It's Javad.
Javad, I'm so sorry.
Variant. See, that's a textual variant right there. We knew what we were talking about.
Exactly. I apologize. Thanks for correcting me. Yeah. So I know that this is probably asked by a lot of people. But what are your thoughts on the notion that the preservation of the Quran is a self-fulfilling prophecy?
So can you elaborate on that a little bit? Sorry.
Yeah. So we know from the tradition that, like, the Quran says that the Quran is going to be preserved forever. So wouldn't that cause people to keep preserving the Quran just to make sure that what God said is going to be fulfilled and that it's not going to be like kind of invalidated?
So I would say two things on that. So number one is, I do think it's problematic to say that from a historical critical method, to say, or even from a reasoning rational. I don't even think Ghazali would do this, or some of our scholars of old. They would not say that we could justify the Quran through the text of the Quran itself. So if the Quran says it's preserved, we can't then say that that's proof that the Quran is preserved. That's circular logic, as you know,
mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So we can't do that. Mm-hmm. Number two is, as far as your question, I feel is more a theological question almost. I would say that if that's the case, okay, that's how God acted in the world, right? Mm-hmm. It still fulfilled what it needed to fulfill, right? Mm-hmm. I do think that God uses natural means to his ends, right? Mm-hmm. Finally, so that's my second point. And my third point, and on that second point, I would say that we see the heroic efforts of these early Muslims, how they preserve the Quran, mm-hmm. and we should pay homage to that, mm-hmm. or homage to that. Sorry. And then my third point is, I do think, I'm not using it as a proof, but I do think that verse is fulfilled because of how well the Quran is preserved. So I got to be honest, as somebody studying in the Western Academy, part of my heart trembles when I start reading. Even when I opened Brubaker's book, my heart is, my hair is on end. I'm ready. I'm bracing myself. And I was like, what? This is it? This is all they got? I mean, you should see his YouTube, like the comments under his YouTube, what the people are saying, like his followers, his supporters, which he doesn't seem to be correcting. They're just acting as if all of Islam has fallen and the Quran has fallen. And I'm like, really? This is your worst you could do? So that's my viewpoint on it. Do you have anything you'd want to add on that?
Not necessarily. I just wanted to know your perspective, because every time I think about the fact that the Quran itself says that it's going to be preserved, I come to the conclusion that it's circular logic, just as you said. So I don't know. I mean, it's definitely is not a thing that shakes my faith or whatever, but like I keep thinking about it and I never reach a conclusion logically.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's it.
So one other thing, we could use this prescriptively from a theological standpoint. We could say that whatever we have now in our hands is, this is a theological argument, it's not a historical critical argument, but whatever we have in our hand now is what God intended us to have, right? So even if these minor variations exist due to whatever causes, this is what God intended us to have, and so this is what we have, and we can rely on it. So we can actually kind of flip this around, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Instead of like, oh my God, is the Quran preserved? No, this is saying that whatever we have, this is what God intended. Clearly, we understand that God intended this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is circular logic. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that we could flip this around.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. I think we'll call it a day. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, Namera, for your comments. I agree that everybody's always worried about their faith being shattered. I hope that we expanded your worldview in this course. If any mistakes were made, they are mine. I'm still a student of knowledge, and I'm, change and evolve and learn things. And I'm sure a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, I will want to revise what I have said. But, it's just a starting point, just some bookmarks for you on your own journey. Please.
Thank you so much. It was a really enjoyable course. And thank you for putting in this immense amount of effort to bring about, to share so many topic areas. So heartfelt thanks.
Thank you. And so for those of you who want to know, Hassan Uncle is my uncle, and brilliant man. I'm glad that he joined us for this course. Thank you for all your feedback and cooperation in the course. Thank you. And thank you for all of you all around the world. I know people have joined. So thank you for those. Numera for waking up at 5 a.m. to take the course. Thank you. God bless. I hope you success in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jawad. Now, one thing I would say that your course has been really valuable is just almost valuable or reassuring. Back to faith being shattered is over centuries people have pondered the range of questions, including today, and that's kind of a normal range of questioning assumptions and within your sort of boundaries of faith and sort of looking at those things all the way, including to your last, what you call very controversial topic. I have always wondered, right, what are the ranges, what was left out, what was included when the Quran was assembled through sort of an oral tradition afterwards. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nadeem Sam. Thank you so much for your input. Thank you, Omar. Thank you. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me. I have to say that, right? That's what everybody says on social media. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Facebook. Follow me on YouTube. And I promise I'll send out information about the coffee hour on the Google Chat, and then Google Classroom, sorry, and then also about the YouTube show that I'm planning on launching. Thank you so much. God bless. Assalamu alaikum.